It's Memorial Day weekend in 2016. We're in Hope Mills, North Carolina. 20 minutes south of Fayetteville. New homes are under construction. It is a boom time in the area. Ken Lombard takes advantage of the holiday weekend when no one's around to cruise this area, trying to pick a place for he and his family to live.
He sees something, he pulls over, he gets out.
Are they drunk and passed out? Are they sleeping? What are they doing?
Hey, excuse me.
He's completely unprepared for what he sees.
Cumberland County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
Out behind John Griffin Middle School, looks like a young male, not responsive, laying on the ground. He's young. He's got a blindfold on.
He has a blindfold on?
Yeah, it looks like he's been shot, too.
I'm Joshua Hamilton. I began my career in Hope Mills around 2006, and I worked my way up to investigations around 2010. I was attending a really good friend of mine's wedding at Carolina Beach. The phone rings. It was a senior investigator telling me I needed to get back to Hope Mills, that there had been a homicide. I never know when I'm going to get called. So it was a disappointment to have to leave this wedding. But when the phone rings, you have to go. Left my family to enjoy their time at the beach and drove back to Hope Mills.
Yeah, Detective Hamilton and I were on our way back, but it's going to take us a few hours.
His partner, Detective Reagan, goes with him.
We coordinated with the officers at the scene. It was a matter of making sure that all the evidence was collected and properly handled.
I'm the sergeant of one of the 4 platoons on the road for Hope Mills Police Department. And on this particular morning, I was in charge. In my 24 years of service, I've never seen a homicide like this. When we first got the call, we figured it was a hiker or an early morning jogger that just had a heart attack.
When we got here, we found out it was a shooting.
The victim appears to be a teenager, has a shirt or an undershirt tied around his head as if it's a blindfold. Rigor mortis has begun. This body's been dead for more than a few hours and less than a day.
You could see bullet wounds in his body. There was a gash on the top of his head with skull fragments. It looked like he was hit with something on the head.
Let's roll him over, see if he's got any ID on him.
There was 2 projectiles that were found in the dirt underneath the body, as if they had, passed through the body and they were trapped in the dirt. That indicated to us that he was definitely killed in that location.
He did not have any ID on him, so it made it really tough for us to be able to find out why he was out there.
Finding the identity in an investigation is absolutely paramount. You can't establish a timeline. That creates a whirlwind of problems.
Sarge, we've got something over here.
So they work in the area with metal detectors, and they do find a group of expended casings.
The casings were all .380 caliber. It's a pretty common caliber, small, but there were a number of them, which told us we were dealing with a semi-automatic handgun.
We'll keep canvassing the area for a weapon. Good work.
Based on him being blindfolded, the position of the body, it looked as if it was an execution. This was explicitly done with intent and malice. They knew what they were doing when they did it.
Once they had finished processing what they could learn from the body, they would tag it at this point with a John Doe and transport him to the medical examiner in Raleigh so an official autopsy could be performed.
So we got home back to Hope Mills and we went out to the area of McKinnon Farm Road.
I started thinking about who, what, where, when, and why. I found that most homicides in general occur involve sex, money, or drugs. Those three things start going through my head.
Killers, for the most part, respond to normal human emotions. They're often remorseful afterwards. When you get somebody abnormal, which fortunately for all of us is a relatively rare thing, they don't need a reason. They kill because they like it. There's no more dangerous person than that.
How'd this kid get here?
I'm wondering, had he been kidnapped and taken to this location, robbed, shot?
We started creating theories of what could have happened. And we were all over the place, from some sort of gang initiation to a robbery or a drug deal going awry.
When there is no wallet or any paperwork of any kind, the first step is to try to get fingerprints from the hands to see if this person is in the criminal justice system.
Well, it's holiday weekend, but I'll make a phone call to see if I can't get someone in to check his prints.
Right. What's this?
I think it may be tire tracks in the suspect vehicle.
We had little tire tracks, but we also didn't know whose tire tracks belonged to who.
This is a dirt road where people go out there to four-wheel drive. We weren't sure if it was part of the crime scene or if this was kids playing and riding around in their ATVs.
Hey, detectives, I think I've got something over here.
Thank you.
We had located a baseball bat that was on the opposite side of the trail from where the victim was found.
There appeared to be blood and dirt on the tip of it, but they also thought it might have been red paint. This is a construction site. This is an area where kids could be playing.
Kids often attack construction areas by beating on things that aren't theirs and so on. Could it be some painted object somewhere that's where the red came from? It's hard to say, but it's there, so it cannot be ignored.
Looks like we have some company.
The media showed up. They listened to scanners. It's not uncommon for them to hear voices on the radio, and next thing you know, they're gonna show up.
The problem with that was that we didn't need them getting close and disturbing or destroying any evidence.
You're just gonna have to wait back by your van.
Can you just tell us what's going on?
Nope, not right now.
Well, Officer Whitmill is assigned to prevent them from interfering with the investigation. He notices a car. He's seen it a couple of times in the last few minutes driving back and forth near the crime scene.
We didn't know why they were there, what they were up to. So it was kind of odd that somebody would just show up there and watch us.
There's an old expression in law enforcement, it's called JDLR. Just doesn't look right.
That made us really suspicious that these might be the suspects.
It's not unusual for a suspect to return to the scene of a crime or even remain present at the scene of a crime to see what the police are up to.
I was notified that this car's driven by multiple times, so I had the officers initiate an investigative stop on the vehicle.
Hey, stop! Stop right there! Roll your window down. What are you guys doing out here right now?
Is there a problem, officer?
It's important to talk to them. Who are they, and what's their explanation for being in this area?
The officer was able to talk to the two people, and they said, we're just looking around, just kind of curious, that sort of thing.
They say, that's not against the law, is it? No, it's not. But you still confirm. You check it out.
They asked them where they were on the night of May 27th of 2016, where the car was.
He explains that they were in the military stationed at Fort Bragg. They verify that both men were on duty that night, and therefore they could not be involved in this homicide.
I think they were just being fairly nosy. Wanted to know what was going on in the area. It all led back to nothing. Just got to continue to drive on and come up with something else.
So it's time to take the next step. They take prints from the remains of this young man to see if this person is in the criminal justice system.
And unfortunately, he had not been entered in the APHIS fingerprint system, which told us, one, we were dealing with a young person that possibly had never been in trouble.
He is a truly innocent victim.
Thank you.
We started searching missing person reports from neighboring jurisdictions.
And I called almost every police department in the area, sheriff's office and police department, probably in a solid 30 to 50 mile radius of Hope Mills looking.
All of them come back, no missing reports matching his description.
I appreciate it.
At the present moment, our young man is nothing more than a ghost. No one seems to know who he is or where he's from.
It really gets frustrating because identifying your victim shouldn't be the hard part. The hard part should be trying to figure out who committed this heinous crime.
Well, Hamilton and Reagan have got this search underway. They re-canvass the neighborhood and make sure that no one saw or heard anything.
I want witnesses. I want people to start knocking on doors and talking to people. You're not going to know what people seen. You're not going to know what people heard until you start asking them whether they want to talk to you or not. If they don't, a lot of times they'll take a card and call you later.
They run across a woman in the neighborhood about a half a mile away from the crime scene.
Oh, I did hear something. I'm in charge of our neighborhood watch group.
Oh, wow. She's the chairperson of the neighborhood watch group. She could be a great resource.
She was telling us that several people had posted on their community board about hearing shots fired in the area on Friday night.
Here it is.
He says he heard the gunshots just after 11:30 p.m.
Any others?
Yeah, let me find it. Here it is.
Just before midnight.
That is the first significant piece of information they have. They can now start building a timeline for this murder. But the question remains, who is John Doe?
While all this is going on, the victim had been transported to the offices of the Chief Medical Examiner in Raleigh.
As you can see, we got quite a few bullet wounds to the torso and upper body.
They learned the victim has suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, the arm, and the right thigh.
He had been shot from different angles. That told me immediately that he was rolling around and he was alive when he took most of his shots. There was nothing quick about how he died.
But there's more evidence of assault here.
The skull had been deformed like it had been hit with a blunt object several times.
The Chief Medical Examiner confirms that the cause of death was the blow to the head.
Excuse me, sorry. This is Hamilton.
When Hamilton's at the coroner's office, his cell phone rings. It's a friend of his from Oak County Sheriff's Department.
He told me that they had responded to a missing person report filed by Amanda Daniels. Amanda reported her brother missing.
It was for a 16-year-old young man, and his name was Andrew Dorenzi.
Thank you. We got a likely candidate. They're going to email me a picture sent by the kid's family.
She was able to send me a picture to my cell phone immediately, and when I seen the picture, I knew we were looking at the individual we were supposed to be. That was definitely him, without a doubt.
Here it is.
He takes his cell phone and holds it up next to the face on the morgue table. Oh, God. That's him. That's our kid. The first step is to make a death notification to the Dorenzi family.
Death notifications are the worst. Breaks your heart, especially you're dealing with a kid.
And we apologize for being here under these circumstances.
When they came up to the house, my sisters were there, and me and my husband.
We kind of knew what to expect. My whole drive home from work, I just cried and prayed and tried to figure out what was going on. And we told the family that a body had been discovered and that we had some photographs that we like somebody to look at and see if they could identify the body.
My husband was like, I'll check it so they don't have to. And I'm a control freak, so I'm like, no, I'm going to look at this photo with you.
You can step over here, please.
So then Detective Hamilton pulled a phone out, and when he turned it on, there was a picture on there, and I could immediately tell it was Andrew.
They were both looking at the picture, and I could see by Amanda's expression on her face that it was him.
My stomach definitely dropped when I saw his face on the phone. The differences in the way he looked the last time I saw him alive to the way he looked in the picture was just kind of terrifying.
I just started crying. I fell to the floor. I kept screaming that this can't be real.
All I could do was hug on his sisters and let them know that, we were going to do everything we could to find out what happened to him and punish the ones who did it.
Nate and Amanda walked down the porch with me, and we started talking about Andrew.
Andrew was 14 when he came to live with us because my mom was having some health issues.
He just needed a place to have a better living environment than what his mother could give him.
So she ended up letting him come up and stay with us.
Amanda and I had 3 boys, and they just loved their Uncle Andrew.
He was definitely more like a bigger brother to them. It was beautiful. I was like, that's so cute. He's trying to teach him everything.
They explained he's 16 years old and he's very bright. He's homeschooled. He works 2 jobs.
He wanted to be a pilot. He just wasn't sure if he wanted to go the military route to do it or figure out his own way to pay for flight lessons to do it.
Do you recall the last time you spoke with Andrew?
Yeah, I just spoke with him Friday night.
I called and had to ask him for money. His car had broken down near McKinnon Farm Road, and he needed money to try to get a tow truck. I explained to him that I didn't have any cash at the time, but I could come out to where he was and get his car fixed there. But he had told me that I didn't need to worry about that and that he was safe. And that was just kind of a weird thing for him to say at the time.
This call puts Andrew at the crime scene. But the question is, where is Andrew's car? Did the killer take it? They put on an APB and continue with their interview.
We learned that Andrew had a bank account that was linked to Amanda and Nate's bank account.
Huh. That's odd.
What's that?
Do you know anything about these withdrawals?
So we had seen that on Friday he had withdrawn $80 from his account, and then later on had moved $120 from Amanda's account to his and withdrew it.
I was like, what is he doing? This is not Andrew. He does not take money like that.
So that Saturday, we just continuously called him and texted him to try to figure out where he was, why he took all the money out of Amanda's account, and just couldn't get a hold of him.
Amanda kept thinking that maybe something was wrong with his phone. And Sunday, nobody heard from him, and we decided that Amanda should go file a missing persons report.
Could these bank withdrawals be linked to his murder? What if somebody is aware he has access to money and takes it under threat of death and then kills him anyway? Since he's homeschooled, they're going to ask, so who does he run with? who's he spend his time with?
We had told the detectives that Andrew really only had one friend, and his name was Daniel.
And according to the family, Andrew actually moved in with Daniel a few weeks earlier.
Andrew was definitely an independent kid. He was kind of ready to get out on his own and start being an adult.
Hey. Hey, man. Thanks again for letting me stay here.
Yeah, it's cool. We're gonna grab something to eat. You guys wanna come with?
Yeah, I could eat. What about you? Sure. Let me just throw my stuff down.
We had met Daniel at the Fort Bragg Fair just a couple weeks prior to this. His mom was a bail bondsman, but we didn't really know much else about him.
When she said that, I knew exactly who she was talking about. There was only one female bondsperson that I was familiar with that had a son named Daniel.
They call her and they tell her they want to have a conversation with her son, Daniel. She agrees to set this meeting up at her office.
Hey, Mary.
Hey. Come on back. We're glad to help you. Daniel's back here in the back office.
So they go in and sit down with Daniel.
Hey, thanks for meeting us.
Yeah, hi. What's all this about?
Daniel was 19 years old, clean cut, well dressed, and we told him while we were there that we wanted to talk about Andrew.
First thing out of his mouth was, yeah, I heard about Andrew. It's bad how he was left out in the woods like that.
It's really messed up, you know.
It was like light bulbs going off in my mind because we had never released to the media anything other than a death investigation, not even that it was a man or a woman. So it told us he knew something more than what he should have.
So how does Daniel know that? Well, that is the million-dollar question. Daniel Hall has stated facts to Hamilton and Reagan that he could not reasonably know unless he was involved.
He said, you know, it's really messed up how they found him shot up like that.
So now alarm bells go off in their heads. Hamilton's alarms are ringing so loud he can't hear himself think.
I kind of glanced over at Regan, and I knew exactly he caught on to it too. We knew we were about to get something out of him at that point.
I heard you and Andrew were living together recently.
Yeah, me, Andrew, and my brother Devin. But it was just for a little while.
Hey, give me some of that.
Yeah, you got something to drink?
Yeah, check the fridge. You guys have any cash? We need to pay that electric bill.
Yeah, I'm working on it.
He said Andrew moved in with he and his brother Devin, but they were having trouble paying their bills.
You hear me, Andrew?
Yeah, I don't got it right now, but...
Daniel explains they were evicted the week before Andrew was found dead, and Andrew had not been seen by Daniel for that entire week.
It's an email from the bank. I'm gonna step outside a minute.
We know Andrew used an ATM late that night, so I was working in conjunction with the State Police Credit Union.
The email informs him that they have reviewed the surveillance tapes for the time in question, and they have attached photographs to the email.
In the first image, there was Andrew standing at the ATM withdrawing money, and there was a silver Pontiac Sunfire in the background, obviously waiting on him.
In another picture, Hamilton sees a black male driving a different car. The most interesting fact in Hamilton's view is that Andrew is seated in the back passenger seat. There are others in the car, but Hamilton can't make them out.
We're dealing with a lot of people now. We just need to find out who these people are. I was super excited jumping up and down when I got that picture. We had a lead.
Hamilton knows by his own experience he's probably looking at pictures of the people that killed Andrew Dorenzi.
We should keep going, George.
Wait. There's something that I need to tell you.
When Hamilton rejoins the group after reviewing his photos, Daniel, without being prompted, suddenly wants to change his story.
I picked him up.
I think Daniel realized real quick that we were going to be able to see those banking transactions and tell that they were together on that night.
So I began talking to Daniel, and he actually admits that he saw Andrew Friday night. He admitted that he drove a silver Pontiac Sunfire. He told me that he had picked Andrew up and they had gone to the ATM to get some money that Andrew owed him for a light bill from when he lived with him.
How much money? It was around $80.
Okay, continue.
He said they got a milkshake. Then he took Andrew back to a guy named Ian Robinson's house to drop him off.
It's obvious to Hamilton and to Reagan that Daniel is all over the map with his story. First, he's convinced he hadn't seen him for a week, and all of a sudden he is convinced he saw him yesterday.
Anything Daniel said at that point needed to be corroborated. It's time to go track down Ian and see what Ian has to say.
We find Ian Robinson, and Ian agrees to talk.
Yeah, they were here that night.
His statement was Andrew and Daniel had left together in Daniel's car. They were gone for a short time, but did come back.
Ian's telling us part truths and half truths, but he's not telling us the full truth.
So we got a little harder on him. I told Ian that whoever gets on the train first is going to get the ride. The DA's office was going to look for the most cooperative one, and lying was just going to make it worse.
Ian then says Daniel came running up to the front and said they grabbed Andrew and threw him in the car. They have him. But Daniel never said who they are.
I believe that Ian was not being 100% honest. To what level, I didn't know exactly. So Ian was offered a polygraph examination.
Yeah, whatever you need. Come on, gotta call work though. Hey.
I was like, awesome, let's do this. I set it up that day.
He thinks he can outsmart these detectives. Well, he has another thing coming.
Are we now in the state of North Carolina?
Yes.
Do you know how Andrew was killed?
No.
Do you know for sure who is responsible for Andrew's death?
No.
I'm able to sit in another room and actually watch the test. He's fidgeting around. He's having to be told to sit still. He's just clearly nervous.
Okay, we're all done. Just sit tight and I'll be right back.
The polygrapher came in and basically told me Ian knew way more than he was ever letting on.
Matter of fact, the polygraph examiner that did the examination has done more polygraphs than anybody else in the state of North Carolina, and said it was one of the worst fails he'd ever seen.
So, of course, he got a post-polygraph interview. We didn't even go to a recorded room. We sat outside on the curb. I sat down next to him, and we just had a heart-to-heart. I just told him, look, man, this is the time. It's now or never. The cards were starting to stack against him. His demeanor started changing. That's when he pretty much told us what had happened.
He tells Hamilton that the first part of what he said is true, that Andrew and Daniel went to the ATM machine to get the money that Andrew owed for utilities payment.
He said while they were gone, Devin showed up at his house.
Screwed us to that apartment. Dude, Andrew's out getting the money right now. He needs to cough up more.
Devin said that he was going to kidnap Andrew.
Meeting my friends in a minute and buying a piece off of them. What? A gun? Are you serious? I don't want any part of this. I'm not asking you to do anything. Just keep your mouth shut.
Devin tells Ian, I'm going to take him to the ATM by force and make him pay me. And I'll give you $100 to look the other way.
Ian agreed to accept the $100. And all he knew was Devin did show up when they got back and took Andrew, put him into a car, and drove away.
That's when Hamilton recalls the car seen in the background on the second withdrawal picture.
You recognize this car?
He said he wasn't sure, but he had seen a red car that looked like that one at Devin and Daniel's apartment complex.
Oh, really? Daniel and his brother Devin are in this murder investigation up to their neck.
So now we need to get Devin and Daniel at this point. We make arrangements to start getting some reinforcements together to go over to Devin's apartment where they're living now.
Once we got there, we got notified that Daniel was leaving the house. So we instructed one of the officers to go ahead and stop him.
Here he comes, guys. Here he comes. Go, go, go.
Daniel, put your hands in the air. Put your hands in the air. Do not move. Do not move. Put your hands behind your back.
He offers no resistance. It's almost as if he's resigned to the fact he's going to be arrested. He just slumps his shoulders and immediately turns around when they tell him to.
He was placed in the custody, put in a car, and transported to Fayetteville Police Department. Then we went with those officers to the apartment.
Everybody on your toes now.
Anytime you're walking up to an apartment like this, there's always some apprehension. This could go really wrong.
Once you kill once, after that it's only numbers. Anyone who is responsible for the death of a human being is dangerous.
I hear him.
They knock loudly. They hear music and voices inside, no response at the door. What is coming through that door next? Bullets or a face? Hard to say. They're prepared for both. When they knock on the door the second time, they're prepared for whatever happens behind that door. But when the door opens, it's a tall kid with unkempt hair.
Are you Devin Hall?
Yeah? What's going on?
I'm gonna need you to come with us. Go. Your hands. Show me your hands. Show me your hands. Yeah.
They push the door open wider, and sitting on the sofa is a thin black male who looks remarkably like the guy in the ATM machine photo.
We had no idea we were looking for this guy, but that's the guy right there. We got eyes on him now.
Get up! Get up! What's your name? Darian Rebels. What kind of car you drive, Darian?
A red Honda Accord. Why?
That's the very same car they saw in the bank photos.
He and Devin Hall were taken to the police department. I began securing search warrants for Darian's car, and then Detective Hamilton started conducting interviews.
I went to talk to Darian. Darian told me that he knew nothing about the homicide.
This is my first time ever being here. I've never murdered anybody, and I know just stuff like that.
Darian doesn't know he's Darian. The usual story. He doesn't know anything about anything. He doesn't know who Andrew is. Never seen anybody named Andrew, never been anywhere. Spent most of his life alone, apparently.
Do you really want to go this route? What route? First-degree murder? No, sir.
I can let you keep digging your own grave.
I laid a picture in front of him of the ATM showing him making a transaction with the victim's bank card. At that point, I just let him start talking.
Darian says that Devin Hall told him that Andrew had given money to Daniel when in fact he should have given it to him. And he's going to get this money from him no matter what it takes to do it.
Darian, being a good friend, said, hey, I'll go help you get that money. It's fine.
What were you doing? I was driving. He took me to a house.
Darian says that Devin said he knew someone that had a gun for sale, and he was going to go get that gun and use it to threaten Andrew with to get his money.
They went and picked up Deontay Walker.
You got the piece?
Yeah. Yeah, I got it.
Get in.
All right.
He got in the car. He was going to accompany that gun until they got the money. Darian said they showed back up over at Ian's, that Devin exited the car, approached Andrew with the gun, ordering that he come with him.
Andrew, get in the car.
I guess they got into some argument, I don't know. And then they all got in the car.
They left the area, told Andrew, you owe me money. Andrew tells him, just take me to an ATM. I'll give you all I can.
Give me your 10 bank card. Now, come on. Okay, here.
He got up to the window and used the PIN number to withdraw $120, which is a maximum withdrawal from an ATM machine.
They leave that location when they go to McKinnon Farm Road. They pull down this dirt road. They all get out of the car.
And then it all happened. Ice and flashes. Gunshots.
And Darian says, I couldn't watch anymore at that point. I got back in the car. So Hamilton goes back and confronts Devin.
Your life is about to change. I'm gonna give you an opportunity to tell me exactly in your own words what happened and why things went so bad. Because at the end of the day, evidence don't lie.
Devin was a very cocky, arrogant individual. He felt that it was pure disrespect that Andrew didn't pay him his share of his debt that was a few $100 that they had to split.
I had called him, I was like, yo, I gotta get something, bro. I don't care what it is, but it can be $10, $15, da-da-da-da. And he was like, I was like, bro, are you serious?
So he came up with the idea to kidnap Andrew and get that money that he felt that he deserved.
Yeah, 120. It was 120. He handed me the money, and I was like, damn. I was really about to let him go. And I called my brother, and I was like, bro, I got the money. I got $120. And DJ was like, yeah, that's some money, but it's not enough.
They leave that location when they go to McKinnon Farm Road. They pull down this dirt road. They all get out of the car, trying to figure out how they're gonna get more money.
You need to come up with some more money, bro. I don't care how you get it, but you better find it somehow.
I can't get you any more money.
Devin says, call your family and get more money. This is the conversation that Nate remembered. And he tells him it's for a car problem, but it's really not for that. It's for Devin. That all fails.
New plan. Tell you what, if you do this, you're cool about it, we'll let you go. Put that on. Get in the car.
So Andrew basically puts a blindfold on himself, a shirt out of the back of the car. They put him in the trunk, and they begin to ride around a dirt road in an undeveloped subdivision.
How do we know he's not gonna say nothing? How are we sure that he's not gonna say anything? And I was like, bro, I'm gonna just have to do it.
Thank you for not killing me. Thank you. I thought you were gonna kill me. Thank you.
He gets Andrew out of the trunk, And Andrew even says to Devin, "Thank you for not killing me." And Devin says in reply, "I got you, man."
I backed up and I fired 3 shots. And I heard him say, "Shoot me in my head."
Shoot me in my head!
So, shot 5 more times. I just went in and got all of them out.
Devin's angry. Angry that Andrew just won't die. And proceeds to pound on Andrew's head until he stops moving.
Do the golf. I just do the bat, the wood, all that. I was like, bro, we gonna take it off.
Devin was probably the coldest individual I've ever seen. He had no remorse for anything he had done. After the interview on him, he asked for one thing, to call his mom. So we called his mom, and I sat there and listened to him tell his mom that he's being charged with murder.
Mom. Baby. I just got charged with 1st-degree murder, 1st-degree kidnapping, 1st-degree armed robbery.
And I'm just watching this ripple effect of families ruined. Andrew's family's life's ruined. Now, Devin, as a parent, I'm just like, Jesus, my Lord.
3 men are charged with taking a 16-year-old boy to a dirt road in Cumberland County and killing him.
Police say it happened last weekend in Hope Mills. 18-year-old Devin Hall, 19-year-old Daniel Hall, and 20-year-old Darian Rebels all are of Fayetteville, and they're all charged in connection. Police are not identifying the 16-year-old victim. All 3 men are being held in the Cumberland County Detention Center.
One thing that was very interesting in this case is none of them had criminal records before this tragic homicide occurred. We spent a lot of time determining what was the appropriate level of culpability for each one of these individuals.
Devin Hall accepted a plea deal for 1st-degree murder, robbery with a dangerous weapon, 1st-degree kidnapping.
He received life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for taking the death penalty off the table.
Daniel Hall helped his brother Devin get Andrew's car away from Ian's house and sold the car. So Daniel pled guilty to accessory after the fact to kidnapping and received 3 years in jail. Ian Robinson accepted $100 for allowing Andrew to be kidnapped there at his house. He pled guilty to accessory after the fact to kidnapping and received about 2 or 3 years in jail.
Deontay Walker brought the gun to the equation.
He also pled guilty to accessory after the fact and received about 2 to 3 years in jail. Darian Rebels, the driver, pled guilty to armed robbery, conspiracy, and kidnapping and received about 10 years in prison for his role.
The hardest part about everything was knowing that the people involved, for the most part, they all knew Andrew and they knew the type of person he was. The world's missing a really great giver to humanity with Andrew gone.
When Andrew first moved in, my kids were always home, and he was trying to teach them work ethic and appreciating the small things and stuff. So that's actually one of the things I still miss, because for me, even though I lost him too, I know that relationship he had and how it affected the kids.
Detectives Hamilton and Reagan handled this case expertly. They pushed all the buttons and they pushed them in the correct order. They were able to resolve a mystery in relatively short order by doing what homicide detectives do. One foot in front of the other. One fact to the next fact. Until you have the right faces in front of you. Precisely what they did in this case. And what they've done in every case. Andrew Dorenzi was an innocent person who wanted to be a...
December 30th, 2002. London was caught in that strange silence that always settles between Christmas and New Year's Day. The city was still awake, buses still moved through the streets, trains still arrived at crowded stations, and the markets around Camden continued to pulse with life. Yet there was a heaviness hanging over North London that morning. A damp winter fog clung to the narrow streets, softening the glow of yellow streetlights that had not yet switched off. The pavement was slick from a cold drizzle that had fallen through the night. Plastic bags drifted along the gutters, pushed by a slow wind that carried the smell of rain, cigarette smoke, and overflowing rubbish bins left behind after the holiday weekend. Camden had always been a place of contradictions. By daylight, tourists wandered through colorful market stalls searching for vintage jackets, vinyl records, handmade jewelry, and photographs worthy of postcards. Musicians played beneath railway bridges while visitors laughed over hot coffee and paper trays of street food. But after sunset, another Camden emerged. The cheerful colors faded beneath orange streetlights. Shop shutters rolled down one by one. The music disappeared, replaced by distant police sirens, arguments echoing from alleyways, and footsteps that moved a little faster than usual. The same streets that welcomed thousands of visitors every afternoon became home to people most of the city preferred not to notice. Women stood beneath awnings to escape the rain. Some wrapped thin coats tightly around themselves against the freezing December air. Others wandered from corner to corner, hoping the next passing car might mean enough money for another night indoors, another hot meal, another chance to survive until morning. Homeless men searched through overflowing bins. Drug users disappeared into doorways hidden from passing traffic. Every face carried its own story, but few people stopped long enough to hear any of them. For the police, missing people from this part of Camden rarely became immediate headlines. Lives were messy here. People vanished for days before returning. Friends lost contact. Families often lived hundreds of miles away, sometimes with no idea where their relatives had ended up. Disappearances could easily blend into the background noise of everyday hardship. That was exactly why what happened that winter morning would send shockwaves far beyond Camden's streets. It did not begin with detectives following a clever lead. It did not begin with an anonymous confession or an emergency phone call describing a violent crime. It began with something so ordinary that no one could have imagined it would uncover one of Britain's most disturbing murder investigations. Near a rubbish collection point behind a local pub, several black plastic refuse bags had been left among countless others waiting to be collected. At first glance, they looked completely unremarkable. During the holiday season, piles of garbage were common. Restaurants threw away spoiled food. Shops cleared unwanted stock. Residents emptied homes after Christmas celebrations. The bags blended naturally into the untidy landscape. Until someone noticed that something about one of them looked terribly wrong. The bag had split slightly near the bottom. Something pale protruded through the torn plastic. It was not cardboard. It was not discarded food. It did not resemble anything that belonged in an ordinary rubbish pile. Curiosity became uncertainty. Uncertainty became fear. Within minutes, fear turned into horror. Emergency services arrived expecting what many initially hoped was some kind of misunderstanding. Officers carefully secured the immediate area while forensic specialists began examining the bags one by one. As more plastic was opened, that fragile hope disappeared almost instantly. This was no accident. Someone had deliberately attempted to dispose of human remains. The realization spread silently among the investigators. Conversations became shorter. Faces hardened. Every movement became measured and deliberate. Experienced officers who had spent years investigating violent crime understood immediately what this discovery suggested. Whoever had left these bags behind had invested time, planning, and emotional detachment. Crimes like this rarely happened in panic. They usually reflected something much darker. Word spread rapidly through Scotland Yard. Senior detectives were called in. The Metropolitan Police established a major incident room before many Londoners had even finished breakfast. The questions came faster than the answers. Who was the victim? Where had the killing taken place? How long had the remains been there? Was this an isolated homicide? Or was someone still out there, walking freely through the streets of North London? At that moment, nobody knew that the investigation would eventually lead officers only a short distance away from where the bags had been found. Nobody knew that the suspect had lived quietly among thousands of ordinary residents. Nobody knew that months earlier, police officers had already entered his flat. And nobody realized that one fatal mistake made during an earlier investigation may have allowed a killer to claim more lives. As detectives expanded the search around Camden, the neighborhood carried on almost normally. Market traders arranged their displays. Delivery vans squeezed through narrow streets. Commuters hurried toward underground stations without noticing the growing number of police vehicles parked nearby. Television crews had not yet arrived. The public had no idea that one of London's darkest criminal investigations had already begun. Behind the yellow police tape, forensic officers worked patiently despite the freezing weather. Every discarded wrapper, every footprint pressed into damp pavement, every fingerprint hidden beneath layers of moisture had the potential to reveal the identity of the person responsible. The black refuse bags themselves became silent witnesses. Their knots, their brand, the way they had been tied, the order in which they had been placed, all of it mattered. Experienced investigators understood something many people never consider about homicide investigations. Murderers often believe they have erased every trace of themselves. Yet the very act of trying to conceal a crime frequently creates new evidence. A decision made in haste. A route chosen out of convenience. A purchase remembered by a shopkeeper. A camera mounted high above a doorway, recording every ordinary movement without attracting attention. The person responsible almost certainly believed these bags would disappear into London's endless waste disposal system, mixed with thousands of others before anyone looked inside. Instead, they became the beginning of a trail. A trail that would slowly expose not only a killer, but also uncomfortable questions about missed opportunities, overlooked warnings, and a criminal who had managed to remain invisible despite standing in plain sight. In the days that followed, newspapers would give him a name designed to evoke fear and history. The Camden Ripper. It was a nickname that immediately echoed one of Britain's most infamous unsolved legends, inviting comparisons that dominated headlines across the country. Yet beneath the sensational title lay a far more unsettling reality. This was not a mysterious figure disappearing into Victorian fog. This was a modern man living in a modest London flat, surrounded by neighbors, shops, buses, surveillance cameras, and one of the largest police forces in the world. He did not hide in abandoned buildings. He did not flee the country. For months, he continued living an ordinary routine while unimaginable violence remained concealed behind an ordinary front door. And by the time investigators finally arrived at that address, they would discover that the horrifying evidence waiting inside was only part of the story. The most disturbing chapter had actually begun long before anyone opened those black plastic bags on that cold December morning. The address did not stand out. It was neither an abandoned warehouse nor a secluded farmhouse hidden beyond the reach of curious eyes. It was an ordinary council flat in Camden, surrounded by the familiar rhythm of city life. People passed by every day without slowing down. Neighbors carried groceries upstairs, argued over parking spaces, greeted one another with brief nods before disappearing behind identical front doors. Delivery drivers came and went. Children laughed in nearby streets during the afternoon. At night, televisions flickered behind curtains while buses rumbled past every few minutes. It was the kind of place where anonymity came naturally. In a city as large as London, people learned to mind their own business. The man living there had become just another face in the neighborhood. His name was Anthony John Hardy. By the winter of 2002, Hardy was 51 years old. His appearance rarely attracted attention. He was not especially tall or physically imposing. His thinning hair and aging features blended easily into the crowds that moved through Camden every day. If someone had crossed paths with him at a supermarket or on the underground, they probably would not have remembered him 5 minutes later. That ordinariness would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. There were no dramatic disguises. No hidden identity. No carefully constructed public image of wealth or influence. Hardy lived quietly, almost invisibly, inside a community already filled with people struggling through their own hardships. He occupied the same streets as students, artists, office workers, rough sleepers, addicts, tourists, and sex workers. Everyone had somewhere to be. Few had time to wonder about the quiet man walking past them. But ordinary appearances often conceal complicated histories. Long before detectives learned his name, Hardy's life had already been marked by instability. Court records would later reveal a history of mental health treatment that stretched back years. He experienced periods of severe psychological distress and had been admitted to psychiatric hospitals on multiple occasions. These records became an important part of understanding his background, though investigators and mental health experts alike emphasized that mental illness alone does not predict violent crime. Millions of people live with psychiatric conditions without ever harming another person. Hardy's history was not presented in court as an explanation for murder. Instead, it formed part of a much larger picture, a life that had gradually unraveled over decades. There had once been a marriage. There had once been hopes for an ordinary future. Those hopes faded. The relationship collapsed, leaving Hardy increasingly isolated. As the years passed, he drifted further from stable employment and meaningful relationships. Isolation settled into his daily routine. His flat became both his refuge and his prison, a place where few people entered and even fewer stayed for long. Outside, Camden never stopped moving. Inside, another reality was taking shape. Investigators would later spend countless hours reconstructing Hardy's movements during the months leading up to his arrest. They pieced together receipts, witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence. What emerged was not the portrait of someone constantly hiding in the shadows, but someone capable of slipping unnoticed between ordinary routines. He bought groceries. He walked familiar streets. He used public transport. He exchanged brief conversations with strangers. Nothing about those everyday actions suggested the horror that detectives would eventually uncover. That disconnect between appearance and reality is one of the reasons the Camden case continues to fascinate criminologists and investigators. Popular imagination often expects violent offenders to look frightening or behave erratically in public. Reality is frequently far less dramatic. Some offenders blend into ordinary environments with remarkable ease, not because they possess extraordinary intelligence, but because everyday life encourages people to overlook one another. London itself almost encouraged invisibility. A city of millions offers endless opportunities to disappear without ever leaving. On any given day, thousands of strangers crossed paths without exchanging a single word. Faces blurred together. Lives overlapped briefly before moving apart forever. In that environment, a quiet middle-aged man attracted little attention. Meanwhile, another group of people moved through Camden under circumstances that made them especially vulnerable. Many of the women working the streets lived unstable lives shaped by poverty, addiction, homelessness, or fractured family relationships. Some slept in temporary accommodation. Others relied on shelters when space was available. Some maintained contact with relatives who worried constantly but could do little to help. Others had gradually lost touch with almost everyone who had once known them. Each woman carried a history that existed long before police files reduced her identity to the word victim. They had favorite songs, childhood memories, moments of laughter, dreams that had slowly become more difficult to reach. To strangers rushing past them on cold evenings, they were often little more than silhouettes standing beneath streetlights. To the people who loved them, they remained daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. This difference would become painfully important after the investigation began. As media attention intensified, headlines focused heavily on the killer. His nickname spread rapidly across newspapers and television broadcasts. Yet detectives working the case repeatedly stressed another reality. 3 women had lost their lives, and understanding who they were mattered just as much as identifying the man responsible. Before they became evidence in a homicide investigation, They had lived complicated human lives. That perspective shaped many of the officers assigned to the case. For homicide detectives, identifying victims is never simply an administrative task. Every confirmed identity opens another window into the final weeks, final days, and sometimes final hours before death. Friends remember conversations. Family members recall unusual phone calls. Shelter workers notice someone who stopped showing up. Shopkeepers recognize familiar customers who suddenly disappear. The dead begin speaking through the memories of the living. As investigators expanded their inquiries across Camden, they quietly started asking difficult questions. Who had seen these women last? Who regularly approached vulnerable women in the area? Had anyone noticed a familiar face repeatedly offering rides or invitations? The answers did not arrive immediately. Instead, they emerged slowly, scattered across dozens of interviews conducted in cafes, hostels, police stations, hospitals, and street corners. No single witness possessed the entire story. Each remembered only fragments. A conversation. A face. A location. A date that might or might not have been correct. Like pieces of a broken mirror, those fragments reflected only tiny parts of the truth. Detectives faced the painstaking task of fitting them together without forcing pieces that did not belong. At first, several possibilities remained open. Could more than one offender be involved? Had the remains been moved from another borough? Was this connected to organized criminal activity? Every major investigation begins with competing theories. Experienced detectives resist locking themselves into one explanation too early because premature assumptions can blind an investigation to crucial evidence. So they kept every possibility alive. Every lead was documented. Every reported sighting was logged. Every forensic sample was carefully preserved. The investigation grew larger with every passing day. What no one yet understood was that one of the most important clues had already been quietly recording events long before detectives arrived. Not a witness. Not an informant. Not a confession. A camera. In 2002, closed-circuit television had already become part of everyday life across London. Mounted above shop entrances, fixed to traffic lights, tucked beneath railway bridges and overlooking busy intersections, thousands of cameras watched the city without emotion or fatigue. Most people barely noticed them anymore. They had become part of the urban landscape, as ordinary as bus stops or telephone boxes. To investigators, however, CCTV was something very different. Unlike eyewitnesses, cameras did not become frightened. They did not forget details over time. They did not unintentionally reshape memories after reading newspaper headlines or speaking with other witnesses. They simply recorded what happened within the narrow frame they were given. The challenge was that London contained thousands of hours of footage. Someone had to watch it. Frame by frame. Minute by minute. Detectives began tracing the route surrounding the locations where the refuse bags had been abandoned. They mapped possible paths a person could have taken while carrying heavy black bags through Camden's streets. It was slow, exhausting work. One camera led to another. A figure disappearing from one angle might reappear several streets away. Investigators built timelines, synchronized clocks from different recording systems, and followed movements that at first seemed completely ordinary. Then, a pattern emerged. One man appeared more than once. He was seen carrying black refuse bags. Nothing about his pace suggested panic. He did not run. He did not constantly look over his shoulder. Instead, he moved with the calm, almost routine demeanor of someone disposing of household waste after the Christmas holidays. To an uninformed observer, he would have blended into the background of countless London residents taking out their rubbish. But detectives now knew what had been found inside similar bags. Suddenly, every step that man took became significant. The footage allowed investigators to work backwards. Rather than asking where the bags had ended up, they asked where they had come from. Street by street, camera by camera, the trail narrowed. Eventually, it pointed toward a single residential building. A single flat. A single occupant. Anthony John Hardy. By the time officers prepared to enter the property, they understood they were no longer investigating an unexplained discovery. They were approaching what they believed could be the primary crime scene. No one knew exactly what waited behind the door. Experienced detectives have often described the moments before entering a suspected homicide scene as strangely quiet. Conversations become brief. Equipment is checked one last time. Every officer understands that once the door opens, the investigation may change forever. When investigators entered Hardy's flat, they encountered evidence that transformed the entire case. Forensic specialists immediately recognized that this was not simply a location connected to the disposal of remains. It was central to the crimes themselves. The apartment contained physical evidence linking Hardy to the victims, providing investigators with the foundation they needed to reconstruct what had happened inside those walls. The discovery was devastating not only because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied. The violence had taken place in the middle of a densely populated London neighborhood. People had walked past that building every day. Neighbors had slept only a few meters away. Life outside had continued as normal. Inside, something profoundly disturbing had remained hidden. As forensic teams documented every room, every surface, and every item of potential evidentiary value, another realization slowly began to emerge. This address sounded familiar. Some officers recognized it from earlier police records. Months before the remains were discovered in December, police had already been inside this very flat. The memory was unsettling. Earlier in 2002, officers had attended the property after the death of a woman later identified as Sally White. At the time, the circumstances surrounding her death had been examined, and an initial post-mortem concluded that she had died of natural causes. Based on the information available then, the case did not proceed as a homicide investigation. The file had been closed. The flat had been left behind. Anthony Hardy remained free. Now, standing in the same apartment with overwhelming new forensic evidence surrounding them, investigators were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Had the warning signs been missed? Could this investigation have ended months earlier? Could lives have been saved? Those questions would eventually extend far beyond the homicide squad. They would reach forensic pathologists, legal experts, journalists, and the wider British public. The case would become more than the story of a serial killer. It would also become a story about institutional failure, about how one incorrect conclusion can ripple outward with consequences no one initially imagines. Yet on that day, inside the flat, detectives could not afford to dwell on those questions. Their immediate responsibility was clear. Collect every piece of evidence. Identify every victim. Build a case that would withstand the scrutiny of a criminal court. Because somewhere behind the headlines, behind the nickname that newspapers would soon repeat across front pages, 3 women deserved answers that had come far too late. And the man at the center of the investigation was no longer an unknown figure moving anonymously through Camden's streets. For the first time, the trail had a name. Anthony John Hardy. The investigation that began with a torn rubbish bag had just uncovered one of the most disturbing homicide cases modern London had seen in years. But to understand how an ordinary-looking man came to be known as the Camden Ripper, investigators first had to travel backward in time, long before the police tape, long before the courtroom, and long before his name became synonymous with one of Britain's most chilling criminal cases. That story begins not with the murders, but with the world that shaped both the killer and the women whose lives would tragically intersect with his. The story of the Camden murders cannot be understood without first understanding Camden itself. Long before investigators pieced together surveillance footage or forensic evidence, long before newspaper headlines coined a nickname that would spread across Britain, Camden was already a place where 2 very different Londons existed side by side. They shared the same streets, the same railway bridges, and the same winter sky, yet they rarely crossed paths in any meaningful way. To visitors, Camden represented creativity. It was one of London's most recognizable neighborhoods, famous for its sprawling markets, alternative fashion, live music venues, and colorful storefronts. Tourists arrived from around the world looking for vintage leather jackets, handmade jewelry, rare vinyl records, and photographs of streets painted with oversized murals. Every weekend, the sidewalks filled with people carrying shopping bags and cameras. Street performers competed for attention while the smell of fresh coffee drifted from cafes tucked between independent shops. During daylight hours, Camden felt energetic, almost theatrical. Music spilled from open doors. Conversations blended into the constant rhythm of buses stopping and starting along crowded roads. Vendors called out to passing customers, hoping to make one more sale before evening arrived. For many Londoners, Camden represented freedom, a neighborhood where individuality was celebrated and where people from every imaginable background seemed to fit naturally into the same crowded streets. But like many large cities, London changed after dark. As the markets closed and tourists returned to hotels or underground stations, another Camden quietly emerged. The bright displays disappeared behind metal shutters. The crowds became thinner. The music faded into distant echoes. The streets were still busy, but the people walking them often carried very different burdens. Some hurried home after long shifts. Others had nowhere to go. The neighborhood had long been home to people living on society's margins. Homelessness, addiction, untreated mental illness, and poverty were visible realities. Charities worked tirelessly to provide food, shelter, counseling, and medical care, but the demand often exceeded the resources available. Outreach workers knew many people by name. Police officers assigned to the area recognized familiar faces from previous encounters. Local businesses learned to coexist with problems that had become part of everyday life. Among those struggling to survive were women involved in street-based sex work. Their reasons for being there were rarely simple. Some had experienced domestic abuse that forced them from their homes. Others battled addiction that consumed every source of income they could find. Some had lost stable employment and slowly slipped into homelessness. Others carried years of trauma that had never been properly treated. Every woman had her own history, shaped by different choices, different circumstances, and different moments of misfortune. From a distance, strangers often reduced them to a single label. Up close, they were far more than that. Many maintained relationships with family members despite years of hardship. Some phoned children whenever they had access to a telephone. Others visited shelters regularly enough that volunteers noticed when they failed to appear. Friendships formed among people living similar lives. They watched out for one another whenever they could, warning each other about dangerous clients or areas that suddenly felt unsafe. It was not a perfect system. It was survival. That distinction matters because true crime stories often begin at the moment violence enters someone's life. In reality, every victim already had decades of experiences before that moment ever arrived. They had birthdays, disappointments, favorite songs, childhood memories, hopes that changed with time, and ordinary routines that made them human long before investigators learned their names. The women who would eventually become victims in this case were no exception. Their circumstances made them vulnerable, but vulnerability should never be mistaken for invisibility. One of the challenges facing investigators in cases involving marginalized victims is that disappearances may not immediately trigger large-scale searches. If someone lives alone, lacks stable housing, or has irregular contact with family, days or even weeks can pass before anyone realizes they are missing. Friends may assume they have traveled elsewhere. Outreach workers may believe they found temporary accommodation. Family members might think they simply have not called yet. These delays are not caused by indifference. They often reflect the complicated realities of unstable lives. For detectives, every missing person report contains a difficult question. Is this unusual behavior? Or is it consistent with the person's normal pattern? Answering that question requires time, patience, and an understanding of the individual's life rather than assumptions based solely on appearance or occupation. Camden's geography added another layer of complexity. Busy transport links connected the neighborhood to the rest of London within minutes. Thousands of people entered and left the area every day. Someone could arrive by train in the afternoon, disappear into the evening crowd, and be almost impossible to trace without witnesses or surveillance footage. The sheer volume of movement created opportunity. For ordinary residents, it meant convenience. For offenders seeking anonymity, it could provide cover. Yet focusing only on the environment risks overlooking another important truth. The overwhelming majority of people living or working in Camden never committed violent crimes. They built businesses, raised families, volunteered in local charities, created music, studied at universities, and contributed to the community in countless positive ways. The neighborhood's struggles were real, but so was its resilience. This balance is important because places should never be defined solely by the worst events that occur within them. Even after the murders became national news, many residents described Camden not as a place of fear, but as a community determined to protect its own. Local organizations expanded outreach efforts. Advocates renewed calls for better services supporting vulnerable women, emphasizing that preventing violence required more than simply arresting offenders after tragedies occurred. Those conversations would grow louder in the years following the investigation. But in the months before the case unfolded, life continued much as it always had. Winter arrived. Christmas decorations appeared above shopping streets. Holiday shoppers crowded the markets. Buses ran on altered schedules. Charities prepared additional meals for people facing another cold season without permanent housing. Somewhere within that familiar rhythm lived a man who attracted little public attention. Anthony John Hardy had spent most of his life in London. By the early 2000s, he was living alone in a modest flat in Camden. Court records later showed that his life had been marked by significant instability, including documented mental health treatment and repeated contact with psychiatric services over many years. These records formed part of the factual background presented during legal proceedings, but experts consistently cautioned against drawing simplistic conclusions. Mental illness, by itself, does not explain violent crime, nor does it predict it. Countless people receive psychiatric care without ever harming another person. Hardy's history was therefore one element of a much larger picture rather than a complete explanation. Those who encountered him casually often described someone who did not immediately stand out. He was another middle-aged London resident moving through crowded streets where strangers rarely paid close attention to one another. In a city of millions, anonymity came easily. That anonymity would prove to be one of the defining features of the investigation. Because while Camden's streets bustled with life above ground, investigators would later discover that beneath the appearance of ordinary routine, a series of decisions had already begun that would culminate in one of the most disturbing criminal investigations London had faced in years. And before detectives could understand what had happened inside a quiet flat in Camden, they first needed to understand the people whose lives intersected there. The next chapter of this story begins not with the man who would become known as the Camden Ripper, but with the women whose identities deserved to be remembered long before they became victims in a criminal case. Every criminal investigation begins with names. They appear first as entries in police reports, hospital records, missing person files, or witness statements. But long before those names become part of an investigation, they belong to real people whose lives are far richer than any official document can capture. That is especially true in cases involving individuals who lived on the margins of society, where years of hardship often overshadow everything that came before. One of the enduring lessons of the Camden case is that it is impossible to understand the full weight of what happened without first recognizing the humanity of the women whose lives were taken. The three women for whom Anthony Hardy was ultimately convicted of murder were Sally White, Elizabeth Vallard, and Bridget McLennan. Although each woman's story was different, their lives shared certain realities. They had all experienced periods of profound instability. They spent time in and around Camden, a neighborhood where people struggling with homelessness, addiction, financial hardship, or fractured family relationships often found themselves crossing the same streets day after day. The area offered services, shelters, familiar faces, and a community of people who, despite difficult circumstances, looked out for one another whenever they could. To outsiders, those streets sometimes appeared chaotic. To the people living within them, they formed an entire world. Regular faces became familiar. Cafe owners recognized people who stopped by each morning. Charity volunteers remembered who preferred tea instead of coffee. Outreach workers noticed when someone missed an appointment. Even local police officers came to know many individuals by name, understanding that their role often extended beyond law enforcement into helping connect vulnerable people with support services. Life in that environment required constant adaptation. One day might bring temporary accommodation. The next might mean sleeping outdoors. One week offered enough money to eat regularly. The following week could become a struggle simply to stay warm. These circumstances created uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life. Phones were lost or stolen. Addresses changed frequently. Friendships formed and disappeared as people moved between hostels, treatment programs, shelters, or temporary housing. For investigators, these realities presented significant challenges. When someone living a highly structured life suddenly vanishes, the change is often noticed immediately. Employers call. Family members become concerned. Friends report unusual silence. Financial activity stops. Patterns break. For someone whose life already contains frequent disruption, those signals may be far less obvious. Missing appointments might not seem unusual. Changing locations could be routine. Days without contact might simply reflect limited access to a telephone. This does not mean their disappearances mattered less. It meant they were sometimes harder to recognize. Years after the investigation, advocates working with vulnerable women pointed to this reality as one of the broader social issues highlighted by the Camden murders. They argued that every person, regardless of housing status, occupation, or addiction, deserves the same urgency when their safety is at risk. The case reinforced an uncomfortable truth. Some lives receive immediate public attention. Others wait far too long. That disparity remains an important conversation within criminal justice systems around the world. As detectives later reconstructed the victims' final known movements, they relied heavily on people who had shared those streets with them. Outreach workers recalled conversations. Friends remembered seeing them days earlier. Local business owners described familiar routines. None of these memories alone solved the case, but together they helped investigators build timelines that gradually revealed where each woman had been before disappearing. These interviews also painted a picture often absent from newspaper headlines. The women laughed together. They shared cigarettes. They borrowed small amounts of money from friends. They celebrated birthdays when circumstances allowed. They worried about one another during cold weather. Like every community, theirs was built on countless ordinary moments that rarely appear in official records. Those details mattered because they restored individuality to people too often reduced to statistics. The investigation would eventually reveal that Anthony Hardy had encountered these women within the same neighborhood they knew so well. According to evidence presented in court, he approached or became acquainted with them in Camden before they entered his flat. Beyond those established facts, many questions about the precise nature of those interactions remain unanswered. Investigators avoided speculation where evidence did not exist, focusing instead on the physical findings that could be proven in court. That commitment to evidence became one of the defining strengths of the prosecution. Every conclusion needed forensic support. Every timeline required corroboration. Every statement had to withstand legal scrutiny. This approach was particularly important because the crimes themselves generated enormous media attention. Public interest was intense. Newspapers competed to publish new developments. Television broadcasts devoted extensive coverage to the investigation. In an atmosphere filled with speculation, detectives worked carefully to separate verified facts from rumor. The distinction was critical. A compelling theory is not evidence. A disturbing possibility is not proof. Investigators understood that successful prosecutions depend not on dramatic narratives, but on facts that can be demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt. While police quietly assembled those facts, Anthony Hardy continued to exist as an almost invisible figure within the neighborhood. He was not living under a false identity. He was not constantly fleeing authorities. He occupied a small flat only a short distance from places investigators would later examine in extraordinary detail. Looking back, many people have asked the same question. How could someone responsible for crimes of such magnitude remain unnoticed for so long? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. Cities create distance between people. Neighbors may exchange polite greetings for years without ever entering each other's homes. Residents often leave for work before sunrise and return after dark. Some people deliberately seek privacy, and in most circumstances that privacy is respected. Ordinary behavior can conceal extraordinary secrets. History has shown this repeatedly in criminal investigations across many countries. The Camden case became another reminder that appearances alone rarely reveal the whole truth. Yet it also highlighted something equally important. Violent crime does not emerge from a vacuum. It unfolds within communities shaped by housing, healthcare, policing, addiction services, economic inequality, and public policy. None of these factors excuse criminal acts. Responsibility for murder rests entirely with the offender. But understanding the environment in which crimes occur can help society recognize vulnerabilities and strengthen protections for those most at risk. In the years after Hardy's conviction, discussions surrounding the case increasingly expanded beyond the individual offender. Questions were raised about support systems for vulnerable women, coordination between agencies, and the lessons that could be learned from missed opportunities identified during the investigation. Those discussions would become even more significant once investigators uncovered a fact that deeply unsettled both police and the public. Months before the murders came to light, officers had already entered Anthony Hardy's flat during an earlier inquiry. At the time, no one realized they had unknowingly stood inside a location that would later become central to one of Britain's most disturbing homicide investigations. That revelation would eventually transform the case from the story of a serial killer into something even more sobering, a case study in how a single investigative error can echo far beyond the moment it is made. But before those failures became public, another story was still unfolding behind the closed door of an ordinary London flat, a story that would remain hidden until a cold December morning changed everything. By the time winter settled over London in late 2002, Anthony Hardy had become almost invisible within the landscape of Camden. Not invisible in the sense that he was hiding from authorities or living under a secret identity, but invisible in the way countless people become invisible in a city of millions. He was one person among many. A man walking down streets filled with thousands of other faces. A resident whose presence blended into the constant movement of urban life. That anonymity was not unusual. London has always been a city where people can live remarkably close together while remaining complete strangers. Apartment buildings can contain hundreds of residents, yet neighbors may know little more than a name on a mailbox or a brief greeting in a hallway. Behind every door is an entire private world that most people will never see. Anthony Hardy's flat was one of those private worlds. From the outside, there was nothing that immediately marked it as different. There was no obvious sign that anything unusual was happening inside. No warning visible to passers-by. No public display that would cause neighbors to stop and question what was occurring behind the walls. That ordinary appearance would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation. The crimes associated with Hardy were not discovered because someone recognized a pattern early. They were not uncovered because a neighbor reported suspicious behavior or because a dramatic confrontation brought the truth into the open. They were discovered because evidence that someone had tried to hide eventually forced itself into view. Before that moment, Hardy existed within a complicated personal history that had developed over many years. Born in London in 1951, he had experienced periods of instability throughout adulthood. His relationships, employment, and mental health had all been affected by difficulties that appeared repeatedly across his life. Records presented during legal proceedings showed that he had received psychiatric treatment and had been hospitalized on several occasions. Those details later became part of the public discussion surrounding the case. Some people asked whether more could have been done to monitor him. Others questioned whether previous encounters with authorities should have resulted in different actions. Professionals involved in mental health and criminal justice emphasized that such questions require careful examination. A person's psychiatric history alone does not determine whether they will become violent. The vast majority of people experiencing mental health challenges are not dangerous. The focus of the investigation remained where it belonged, on the choices and actions of the offender. Understanding a background is not the same as excusing behavior. For investigators, the challenge was not explaining away Hardy's crimes. It was reconstructing the sequence of events that led to them. Every homicide investigation is ultimately a search through time. Detectives look backward. They ask where a victim was last seen, who they spoke with, where they traveled, what choices brought them into contact with the person responsible. They build a timeline from fragments, hoping that somewhere within those fragments is the moment where the path changes forever. In the Camden investigation, those timelines led repeatedly back to the same location. Hardy's flat. A place that appeared ordinary from the outside but would later become central to understanding the case. The investigation also raised questions about how vulnerable people are protected in modern cities. The victims were not random names in a file. They were women whose difficult circumstances placed them in situations where they were more exposed to harm. Their daily lives involved risks that many members of the public never had to consider. Walking home alone could carry uncertainty. Trusting the wrong person could have devastating consequences. Seeking money for basic survival could mean entering dangerous situations. The women who became victims did not choose to be vulnerable. Their circumstances placed them in environments where predators could exploit isolation and hardship. That reality is one reason the Camden case continues to be studied. It is not only a story about one offender. It is also a reminder that criminal investigations often reveal weaknesses that already existed within society. Who receives attention when they disappear? Who is believed when they report danger? Who notices when someone vulnerable stops appearing in familiar places? These questions became part of the wider conversation after Hardy's arrest. But before those questions reached the public, investigators were focused on a much more immediate challenge. They needed to identify the victims. They needed to establish exactly what had happened. And they needed to determine whether the discovery in Camden represented the work of one offender or something larger. The first hours and days after the discovery of human remains are among the most critical in any homicide investigation. Early mistakes can have consequences. Evidence can disappear. Memories can fade. Witnesses can become harder to locate. In the Camden case, detectives moved quickly. The discovery of the remains had transformed an ordinary winter day into a major criminal investigation. The area surrounding the discovery became a carefully controlled scene. Officers searched for anything that could connect the abandoned bags to a specific location, a specific person, and ultimately a specific sequence of events. Behind the scenes, forensic specialists began examining the evidence piece by piece. The process was methodical. There were no dramatic shortcuts. No single clue that immediately revealed everything. Real investigations rarely unfold like fiction. Instead, progress often comes through hundreds of small discoveries, a piece of footage, a witness memory, a forensic result, a document, a timeline that finally makes sense. The breakthrough would come from combining these fragments. The CCTV footage provided one important piece. The connection to Hardy's address provided another. The evidence found inside the flat strengthened the picture. But as investigators continued digging, they uncovered a fact that changed how the entire case was viewed. Anthony Hardy was not a completely unknown figure. Police records already contained his name. And months earlier, officers had been inside the very flat that would later become known as the center of the Camden murder investigation. The discovery created a painful question that would follow the case for years. Had there been a moment when the tragedy could have been prevented? The answer was complicated. Investigations are judged with the benefit of hindsight, but decisions made at the time depend on the information available in that moment. Officers, doctors, and investigators do not know what future events will reveal. They make judgments based on evidence in front of them. However, when later events expose missed warnings, society naturally asks whether those warnings should have been recognized. That tension between uncertainty and responsibility would become one of the most significant parts of the Camden Ripper story. Because the case was not simply about discovering a killer. It was also about understanding how a killer remained free. The answer would emerge slowly, through interviews, forensic analysis, and a detailed examination of events stretching back months before the discovery that shocked London. And at the center of that investigation stood 3 women whose stories would finally receive the attention they deserved, and one man whose ordinary appearance had concealed a reality that investigators were only beginning to uncover. Before the newspapers created a name for the man responsible, before the police investigation filled television screens across Britain, before the courtroom heard the evidence that would define one of London's most disturbing criminal cases. There were 3 women whose lives existed beyond the crime of the victims. The most painful part of the story was not the media attention surrounding the killer. It was the absence left behind. The empty space where a voice used to be. The unanswered questions. The memories that continued long after investigators had that ended them. Their names were Sally White, Elizabeth Ballard, and Bridget McLennan. In the years that followed the Camden murders, much of the public conversation focused on Anthony Hardy. His face appeared in newspapers. His history was examined. His actions became the subject of documentaries and criminal investigations. But behind every headline was a quieter truth. A crime scene does not begin with the offender. It begins with a person who is no longer there. For the families and friends of the victims, the most painful part of the story was not the media attention surrounding the killer. It was the absence left behind. The empty space where a voice used to be. The unanswered questions. The memories that continued long after investigators had finished collecting evidence. Sally White, Elizabeth Ballard, and Bridget McLennan were not simply names connected to a criminal case. They were women who had lived through decades of experiences before their paths crossed with Anthony Hardy. They had childhoods. They had relationships. They had moments of happiness and moments of struggle. They had ordinary days that would never appear in police files. The investigation would eventually examine the final chapters of their lives, but remembering them requires looking beyond those final moments. Because a person's life cannot be measured only by the way it ends. Sally White was one of the earliest known victims connected to Hardy. Her death would later become one of the most controversial parts of the investigation because of the circumstances surrounding the initial response. Unlike the discovery of the remains in December 2002, Sally's death did not immediately trigger a murder investigation. When authorities first became involved, her death was assessed differently. The initial conclusion was that she had died from natural causes. At the time, the evidence available led investigators down that path. But months later, after Hardy was arrested and a wider investigation began, Sally White's death was re-examined. New forensic considerations changed the understanding of what had happened. What had initially been treated as a tragic but natural death was later recognized as a homicide. That change would become one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the case. For those who cared about Sally, the realization carried a particular kind of pain. It meant that the truth had arrived late. It meant that the official understanding of what happened to her had changed only after another investigation forced authorities to look again. The case of Sally White became a reminder that every investigation begins with uncertainty. Police officers, medical professionals, and forensic experts must make decisions based on the information available at a specific moment. But when new evidence emerges, those decisions may need to be revisited. For Sally, that reconsideration came after she was already gone. The same streets that connected the victims also connected countless other stories. Camden in the early 2000s was a neighborhood where people from completely different worlds existed within a few streets of each other. Tourists walked through markets during the afternoon. Office workers traveled through busy stations. Musicians performed outside venues. At the same time, people experiencing homelessness or poverty searched for ways to survive another day. For women living in vulnerable circumstances, the dangers were often hidden in ordinary encounters. A conversation with a stranger, An offer of help. A promise of money. A place to stay. Many crimes against vulnerable people begin not with force, but with manipulation. Offenders often exploit needs that are already present. They recognize loneliness, financial desperation, or a desire for safety, and they use those circumstances to create trust. This pattern is not unique to the Camden case. It is about understanding appears repeatedly in investigations involving victims who are socially isolated or overlooked. That is why understanding the victim's circumstances is so important. It is not about blaming their choices. It is about understanding the conditions that allowed a dangerous person to approach them. Elizabeth Ballard and Bridget McLennan were also women whose lives intersected with Camden's difficult realities. Like Sally White, they were part of a community that existed largely outside the attention of mainstream society. People passed them every day. Some noticed. Many did not. This is one of the uncomfortable truths revealed by many true crime investigations. Victims are often visible and invisible at the same time. They may stand in familiar places. They may speak with people regularly. They may be known within a small community. Yet the wider world may know almost nothing about them until tragedy forces their stories into public view. After the murders were discovered, investigators relied heavily on those who had known the women in life. Friends, acquaintances, and people who shared the same streets helped reconstruct their final movements. Their memories became an important part of the investigation. A person who remembers a conversation. A person who remembers seeing someone at a familiar location. A person who remembers that a woman who was usually present had suddenly disappeared. These small details can become powerful evidence. But they are also something more. They are reminders that the victims belonged to a community. In the aftermath of violent crime, there is often a natural focus on solving the mystery. Who did it? How were they caught? What evidence proved their guilt? Those questions are essential. But there is another question that matters just as much. Who were the people whose lives were taken? For Sally, Elizabeth, and Bridget, the answer cannot be found only in court documents. Their identities existed before the investigation began. They were people with complicated lives, shaped by circumstances that were often difficult and unfair. They experienced struggles, but those struggles did not define their entire existence. A person's hardships are only one chapter of their story, not the whole book. The tragedy of the Camden murders was not only that 3 women were killed. It was that 3 lives with their own histories, relationships, and possibilities were permanently interrupted. Their deaths exposed weaknesses in the systems designed to protect vulnerable people. They raised questions about policing, forensic decision-making, social services, and the way society responds when people living on the margins disappear. But before those questions could be examined, investigators first had to understand what happened in the final days of the victims' lives. Because every homicide investigation is ultimately a reconstruction. A search for the moment when an ordinary day became the last day. A search for the person who entered their lives. A search for the truth that remained hidden behind a closed door in Camden. And as detectives began rebuilding those final timelines, they would uncover the connection between 3 women who never should have met the same fate and a man who had managed to hide in plain sight. The difficulty in telling the stories of Sally White, Elizabeth Ballard, and Bridget McLennan is that the public record surrounding them is dominated by the circumstances of their deaths. Their names became connected to police statements, forensic reports, and courtroom proceedings. Their identities became part of a case file. But a case file can never capture an entire person. A document can record a date. A report can describe a location. A photograph can preserve a face. But none of those things can fully represent a life. That is one of the greatest challenges in telling stories of real victims. There is always a risk that the person disappears behind the crime committed against them. The tragedy becomes the only thing remembered. For the families and people who knew them, however, Sally, Elizabeth, and Bridget were never defined by the investigation that followed. They were individuals who had experienced the ordinary moments that make up every human life. The conversations that seem unimportant at the time. The routines repeated so often they become invisible. The people they cared about. The places where they felt comfortable. The memories that remained with those who loved them. The women who lived in and around Camden during this period were often part of a hidden community. Their lives unfolded in places many members of the public passed without understanding. Shelters, hostels, streets, cafes, and small meeting places became familiar landmarks. Within that world, relationships formed through shared experiences. People looked after one another because they understood the challenges everyone faced. A warning passed between friends could prevent someone from walking into danger. A conversation could provide comfort during an otherwise difficult day. A familiar face could mean the difference between feeling completely alone and knowing someone noticed you. That sense of community existed despite the hardships surrounding it. This is an important part of understanding the victims. Their lives were not empty simply because they were difficult. Hardship does not erase personality. Poverty does not remove dignity. A person struggling with addiction, homelessness, or instability is still a person with memories, emotions, and connections. The circumstances surrounding someone's life may explain why they were vulnerable, but they do not explain who they were. The women connected to the Camden investigation lived in a world where survival often required making decisions under extreme pressure. Choices that might appear simple to someone living with security, a safe home, steady income, supportive relationships, could become much more complicated for someone without those foundations. Finding somewhere warm to sleep could become a priority. Finding money for food could become urgent. Avoiding dangerous situations could become a daily challenge. These realities created opportunities for people who wanted to exploit vulnerability. Investigators examining cases involving vulnerable victims often look closely at the relationships between offender and victim. Many predators do not choose victims randomly. They look for circumstances that make someone easier to approach, easier to manipulate, or less likely to receive immediate attention if something goes wrong. This was one of the central concerns raised after Hardy's crimes were uncovered. The victims were not chosen because they were unimportant. They were targeted because the offender believed their circumstances could be exploited. That distinction matters. It shifts responsibility away from the victims and toward the person who made the decision to harm them. Anthony Hardy was responsible for his actions. The difficult situations the victims experienced did not cause the crimes committed against them. The responsibility belonged entirely to the offender. As detectives investigated Hardy's movements, they attempted to reconstruct how these encounters happened. They examined where he spent time, who he interacted with, and how he gained access to the victims. According to evidence presented in court, he used his presence in Camden to come into contact with vulnerable women before bringing them to his flat. The exact details of every interaction remain known only through the evidence gathered during the investigation and the statements presented in court. But the broader pattern was clear. A man living within the same environment as his victims had found opportunities to approach them. A familiar neighborhood became the setting for crimes that would later shock the country. For investigators, understanding the victims was essential because it helped explain not only what happened, but why the case had remained hidden for so long. When someone disappears from a stable social network, alarms often sound quickly. When someone disappears from a life already filled with uncertainty, the warning signs may be harder to detect. This was one of the painful lessons that emerged from the Camden murders. The safety of vulnerable people depends not only on police response after a crime occurs, but on whether society notices them before tragedy happens. The case also highlighted the importance of listening to communities that are often ignored. People working with homeless individuals, addiction services, and vulnerable women frequently possess knowledge that never appears in official records. They understand patterns. They notice changes. They know when someone who normally appears every day suddenly vanishes. In many investigations, these community connections become crucial. The people closest to the victims often hold the first pieces of the puzzle. A remembered conversation. A last known sighting. A change in routine. A concern that something felt wrong. Those details can seem insignificant individually. Together, they can tell a story. For Sally White, Elizabeth Ballard, and Bridget McLennan, the investigation eventually provided answers about what happened to them. But answers do not erase loss. A conviction can establish responsibility. A sentence can deliver punishment. But neither can restore the life that was taken. That reality is something investigators often carry with them. Solving a case brings a sense of justice, but it does not bring a person back to their family, friends, or community. The courtroom can determine guilt. It cannot undo grief. Years after the case ended, the names of the victims remained connected to important discussions about vulnerable people, criminal justice, and the responsibilities of institutions designed to protect the public. The story of the Camden murders is therefore not only about the discovery of a killer. It is also about the people whose absence revealed failures that had previously remained unnoticed. It is about asking why some disappearances receive immediate attention while others take longer to investigate. It is about recognizing that every victim has a story that began long before the crime. And it is about remembering that behind every photograph shown during a news report, behind every name read aloud in court, there was once a living person moving through the world with hopes, fears, relationships, and memories. Before Sally White became a name in a homicide investigation, she was a woman with her own history. Before Bridget McLennan became linked to one of London's most, Elizabeth Ballard became part of a national headline, she was someone known by people who cared about her. Before Bridget McLennan became linked to one of London's most disturbing cases, she was a person whose life mattered. The investigation would eventually focus on the evidence, the suspect, and the chain of events that led police to Anthony Hardy. But the reason that investigation mattered was never simply because a crime had been committed. It mattered because 3 human beings had been lost. And understanding their stories was the first step toward understanding the true cost of what happened in Camden. In the months after the discovery in Camden, investigators faced a difficult task that went beyond identifying a suspect. They had to reconstruct the lives of the women connected to the case. They had to work backward through time, searching for the moments before everything changed. A homicide investigation often begins at the end. A body. A crime scene. A discovery. But the truth of a person's life exists long before that final chapter. For detectives, the process of understanding a victim is not simply about finding evidence against an offender. It is also about restoring a sense of identity to someone who has been reduced, unfairly, to the worst moment of their life. Every interview mattered. A friend remembering a conversation. A person recalling where someone had been seen. A worker from a support organization describing a familiar routine. These details helped transform the victims from names in a file into real individuals whose absence had been noticed. The people who knew them often carried memories that had nothing to do with crime. They remembered personalities. They remembered habits. They remembered the small details that rarely appear in official documents. The way someone laughed. The way someone told a story. The places someone preferred to spend time. The relationships they valued. These memories are often the most important reminders in cases like this because they challenge the way victims are sometimes portrayed after tragedy. News reports may focus on circumstances surrounding death, but those circumstances represent only a small part of a person's existence. A person is not defined by the danger they faced. A person is not defined by the choices they made while trying to survive. A person is not defined by the actions of someone who harmed them. The lives of Sally White, Elizabeth Ballard, and Bridget McLennan existed beyond the investigation that followed. That understanding became particularly important because the circumstances that surrounded the case made the women vulnerable in ways that were easy for society to overlook. Vulnerability is often misunderstood. It does not mean weakness. It does not mean a person deserves less protection. It does not mean their disappearance should be treated with less urgency. Vulnerability often comes from circumstances outside a person's control: poverty, unstable housing, addiction, trauma, isolation, or a lack of access to support. These factors can place people in situations where dangerous individuals are able to take advantage. For offenders, vulnerability can appear as an opportunity. For investigators and communities, it should be recognized as a reason for greater protection. The Camden murders forced many people in Britain to confront an uncomfortable reality. Some members of society were living in conditions where danger was already part of everyday life. The women connected to this case were navigating a world where simple tasks, finding shelter, earning money, avoiding conflict, staying safe, could require constant effort. Their circumstances did not make them responsible for what happened. They made them targets for someone who chose to exploit them. That distinction became a central part of discussions after Hardy's arrest. The focus remained on the decisions made by the offender, while also examining the wider systems that surrounded vulnerable communities. Could support services have reached more people? Could warning signs have been recognized earlier? Could communication between different agencies have been improved? These questions did not change the responsibility for the crimes. That responsibility belonged solely to Anthony Hardy. But they became part of the broader effort to understand how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. The investigation also revealed how difficult it can be to protect people whose lives exist outside traditional social structures. Many systems rely on patterns. A permanent address. A regular workplace. A consistent family contact. A predictable routine. But many vulnerable individuals do not have those forms of stability. Their movements may change frequently. Their relationships may be complicated. Their struggles may keep them disconnected from institutions that could provide assistance. This creates a dangerous gap. A person can be surrounded by thousands of others and still remain unseen. Camden represented that contradiction. It was a neighborhood full of life. A place where millions of footsteps crossed the same streets. A place filled with music, art, businesses, and visitors. But it was also a place where some people struggled quietly, their difficulties hidden among the noise of the city. The victims were part of that hidden community. They were known by some people and unknown by many others. Their lives intersected with countless strangers who would never realize how important a brief conversation might have been. A few minutes spent talking. A simple act of kindness. A person choosing to notice someone who was often ignored. These moments may seem small, but for people living in difficult circumstances, they can be deeply meaningful. After the case became public, many discussions focused on the offender's psychology and actions. Those questions are common in major criminal investigations. People want to understand how someone could commit such acts and how such behavior can be detected. But there is another question that deserves equal attention. How do we remember those who were harmed? The answer cannot simply be through the details of a crime. The answer must include recognition of their humanity. Sally White, Elizabeth Vallard, and Bridget McLennan became known nationally because of a tragedy they never chose. Their names became attached to an investigation they never controlled. Their lives were discussed in courtrooms and newspapers by people who had never met them. But somewhere beyond those records were personal stories that belonged to them alone. Stories that existed before investigators arrived. Stories that continued through the memories of those who knew them. The search for justice in the Camden case required detectives to examine evidence, follow leads, and identify the person responsible. But justice also requires remembering why that work matters. Not because a case is interesting. Not because a criminal investigation attracts attention. But because real people were lost. The discovery of the remains in December 2002 marked the beginning of a major police investigation. Yet for the victims' families and friends, the story had already entered a different stage. They were facing a reality that no investigation could reverse. Someone they knew was gone. While detectives worked to uncover the truth, those closest to the victims were left with grief, questions, and memories. And as the investigation moved forward, police would begin reconstructing the final days of the three women. They would examine movements, connections, encounters, locations. Slowly, the timeline would take shape. And at the center of that timeline was a place that would become one of the most important locations in the entire case. A place where the evidence would reveal the devastating reality behind the mystery that began with a few abandoned bags on a cold London street. Small flat in Camden. A place where investigators believed the final moments of these women's lives had taken place. A place where the evidence would reveal the devastating reality behind the mystery that began with a few abandoned bags on a cold London street. Every investigation begins with questions. Who was involved? Where did it happen? When did the events unfold? But some questions are more difficult than others because they force investigators to enter the final moments of someone's life. They require piecing together events that no living witness may have fully seen. They require examining traces left behind after a person is gone. The case of Anthony Hardy was no different. By the time police began connecting him to the discovery in Camden, they were no longer looking at an isolated incident. Evidence suggested a pattern, a series of encounters between Hardy and vulnerable women whose lives had intersected with his during the months before his arrest. The investigation would eventually establish that Hardy was responsible for the murders of Sally White, Elizabeth Vallard, and Bridget McLennan. But understanding the case required detectives to reconstruct not only what happened, but how those events unfolded. The timeline began months before the discovery that shocked London. Anthony Hardy lived in Camden, an area where he could move through the same streets as many vulnerable residents without immediately attracting attention. He knew the neighborhood. He understood its rhythms. He was familiar with the places where people gathered, the streets where individuals experiencing homelessness or poverty spent time, and the environments where strangers could meet without drawing suspicion. According to evidence presented during the investigation, Hardy encountered his victims within this setting. These encounters were not dramatic scenes witnessed by crowds. They were quiet moments. A conversation. A meeting between strangers. A decision to go somewhere else. Many violent crimes begin with ordinary interactions that appear meaningless to everyone except the people involved. A person responsible for harm may use familiarity, trust, or a promise of assistance to create an opportunity. Investigators examining Hardy's crimes believed that he exploited circumstances that already existed in his victims' lives. The women were facing difficult realities. Hardy offered access to a private space. That space became the location where the crimes occurred. The flat itself would later become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case. To investigators, it represented more than a physical location. It was where the timeline of the crimes converged. It was where forensic evidence could help answer questions that witnesses could not. Inside those walls, detectives would attempt to reconstruct events that had taken place months earlier. A forensic investigation is essentially a conversation with the past. Objects do not explain themselves. Rooms do not reveal what happened. Evidence must be interpreted carefully. A mark on a surface. A trace left behind. An item moved from where it normally belonged. Each piece can provide information, but only when combined with other evidence does a complete picture begin to emerge. In Hardy's case, investigators examined the flat in detail after his arrest. The evidence they collected helped establish connections between Hardy and the victims. It supported the prosecution's argument that the women had been brought to the property and that their deaths were linked to him. The investigation also revealed the disturbing reality that the crimes had taken place in a location surrounded by ordinary life. Outside the flat, Camden continued as normal. People went to work. Children went to school. Shoppers walked through markets. Neighbors carried on with daily routines. The contrast between ordinary life outside and the events investigators believed had occurred inside became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. For detectives, this contrast is familiar. Crime scenes are often not the dark, isolated locations people imagine. They can exist in apartment buildings, family homes, hotel rooms, and places where people pass every day without suspicion. Violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind familiar doors. One of the most significant parts of the investigation involved the death of Sally White. Her case introduced a painful complication because authorities had already encountered the circumstances surrounding her death earlier in 2002. When police attended Hardy's flat following Sally's death, the initial assessment did not identify it as a homicide. The conclusion at that time was that she had died from natural causes. That decision would later become one of the most criticized elements of the entire case. After Hardy was arrested following the discovery of the remains in December 2002, investigators reopened the circumstances surrounding Sally's death. A new examination of the evidence led to the conclusion that she had in fact been murdered. The revelation changed the understanding of Hardy's actions. It suggested that the events investigators were examining were not limited to the December discovery. There had been an earlier victim. And there was a possibility that the opportunity to intervene had existed months before. For the public, this became one of the most troubling questions surrounding the case. How could someone connected to a murder investigation have remained free? But for investigators and professionals involved in the earlier response, the situation was more complicated. Decisions are made based on evidence available at the time. Medical and investigative conclusions can change when new information emerges. That does not remove the importance of examining mistakes. It does not erase the consequences. But it does show why homicide investigations are often reviewed long after they end. Every decision becomes part of a larger chain. Every missed clue becomes something that must be understood. As detectives continued building the case against Hardy, they also examined the deaths of Elizabeth Ballard and Bridget McLennan. Unlike Sally White's case, these murders became known after the discovery of human remains in Camden triggered the major investigation. The evidence gathered from the scene and from Hardy's flat helped investigators establish connections between the victims and the suspect. The investigation was no longer searching for an unknown offender. It was building a case against one specific man. Anthony Hardy. The public would soon learn his name. But before that happened, detectives had to answer the most important question in any homicide investigation. Could they prove, beyond reasonable doubt, exactly what he had done? The answer would depend on the careful collection of evidence, the reconstruction of timelines, and the work of specialists who would examine every detail left behind. Because in a case where the victims could no longer speak, the evidence had to tell the story for them. And that story was about to become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in modern London. The investigation into Anthony Hardy's crimes was not built around one single moment. It was not a case where a witness saw everything happen or where a confession immediately revealed the truth. Instead, detectives had to reconstruct a sequence of events from fragments left behind. That is the reality of many homicide investigations. The final moments of a victim's life are often hidden from view. The person who could explain what happened is no longer able to speak. The offender may have attempted to erase evidence. Time may have passed before anyone realized a crime had occurred. Investigators must then work backward. They examine what remains. They study movements. They compare statements. They search for connections. They build a timeline until separate pieces begin to form one clear picture. In the Camden case, the timeline began with the relationships between Hardy and the women who became his victims. Anthony Hardy was familiar with the area where he lived. Camden was not simply a place where he happened to reside, it was the environment through which he moved every day. He knew its streets, its busy areas, and the places where vulnerable people gathered. For women living in difficult circumstances, encounters with strangers were sometimes part of everyday survival. A conversation could lead to a job opportunity. A stranger could offer assistance. Someone could appear friendly at a moment when support was desperately needed. This created a dangerous imbalance. A person offering help could also be someone seeking to exploit trust. Investigators later concluded that Hardy used these circumstances to create opportunities to harm his victims. He was able to approach women who were already facing significant challenges and bring them into a private environment away from public attention. The flat in Camden became central to understanding those events. A home is usually associated with safety. A place where people rest. A place where daily life happens away from the outside world. But in criminal investigations, a private space can also become a place where evidence remains hidden. Walls that protect privacy can also delay discovery. For months, Hardy's flat appeared ordinary from the outside. Neighbors continued their routines. The building continued functioning. The surrounding streets continued to carry thousands of people every day. No one looking at the building from the street could have known what investigators would later discover inside. That contrast between appearance and reality became one of the most disturbing themes of the case. The investigation also revealed how difficult it can be to detect crimes against people who exist outside traditional social networks. Many vulnerable individuals do not have daily contact with employers, schools, or relatives who immediately notice changes. Some disappear gradually from public view rather than suddenly. A person may stop appearing at a familiar location. A friend may assume they moved away. A service provider may think they found somewhere else to stay. By the time someone realizes something is wrong, valuable time may have passed. This reality made the discovery in December 2002 particularly important. The abandoned bags did not only reveal a crime. They forced authorities to look at a series of events that might otherwise have remained hidden. The discovery changed everything. A case that might have been investigated as an isolated incident became something much larger. Detectives began searching for connections. They asked whether the victim belonged to the same community, whether similar disappearances had occurred, whether another person had been using Camden's streets to target vulnerable individuals. As the investigation expanded, officers revisited information that had previously seemed unrelated. This is common in major criminal cases. A new discovery can change the meaning of old information. A detail that once appeared insignificant may suddenly become important. A previous report may require another review. A person previously considered irrelevant may become central. That process eventually brought investigators back to Anthony Hardy. The evidence connecting him to the remains found in Camden grew stronger. Surveillance footage showed him moving bags in the area. His address became a focus of the investigation. The search of his flat produced evidence that linked him to the victims. The picture becoming clear was deeply disturbing. But investigators still had to proceed carefully. Public suspicion is not enough. A person's reputation is not enough. A criminal conviction requires evidence that can withstand examination in court. That meant every discovery had to be documented. Every conclusion had to be supported. Every piece of evidence had to fit into a larger explanation. The investigation into Elizabeth Vallard and Bridget McLennan became especially significant because it demonstrated the connection between the discovery in Camden and Hardy's property. The evidence showed that these were not unrelated events. The same offender was connected to multiple victims. The same location appeared repeatedly. The same pattern emerged. A pattern is one of the most important concepts in criminal investigations. A single event can have many explanations. Multiple events with similar characteristics create a different picture. For detectives, patterns can reveal an offender's methods, habits, and choices. But patterns also reveal something else. They show that victims were not isolated incidents. They show that multiple lives were affected. Each name represented a separate person. Each disappearance represented a separate family tragedy. Each investigation file represented someone who would never return home. As the evidence accumulated, investigators faced another difficult reality. They were not only investigating what Hardy had done. They were investigating what might have been prevented. The case of Sally White remained especially troubling because authorities had already been involved before the later discoveries. The fact that her death was initially assessed differently became a major point of discussion after Hardy's arrest. The question was unavoidable. If the earlier conclusion had been different, would the later crimes have happened? No one could answer that with certainty. Criminal investigations deal with facts, not alternate realities. But the question remained because the consequences were so serious. 3 women were dead. A man who had become the focus of a murder investigation had previously been known to authorities. And a series of events had unfolded while the opportunity for intervention may have existed. These questions would continue beyond the investigation itself. They would become part of reviews, public debate, and discussions about how agencies respond to vulnerable victims and complex cases. But at that moment, detectives had one immediate goal. They needed to secure justice for the women whose lives had been taken. They needed to present the evidence clearly. And they needed to ensure that Anthony Hardy could no longer remain a danger to anyone else. The investigation had started with discarded bags on a Camden street. It had led police to a flat. It had uncovered a hidden series of crimes. Now, it was moving toward the next stage, understanding the evidence, examining the suspect, and preparing for the legal battle that would determine Hardy's fate. As investigators continued to reconstruct the events surrounding Anthony Hardy, one of the most difficult tasks was separating what was known from what could only be suspected. In a case that attracted intense public attention, there was enormous pressure for immediate answers. People wanted to understand who was responsible, how long the crimes had been happening, and whether more victims existed. But homicide investigations do not move at the speed of public emotion. They move at the speed of evidence. Every conclusion must be supported. Every timeline must be tested. Every accusation must be proven. For the detectives working the Camden case, the evidence collected from Hardy's flat and the surrounding area became the foundation of their understanding of what had happened. The flat was no longer simply a residence. It had become a crime scene. Every room carried potential information. Investigators examined the environment carefully, searching for connections between Hardy, the victims, and the sequence of events that had brought them together. Forensic teams worked with the knowledge that even the smallest details can become important. A single item, a trace, or an overlooked connection can change the direction of an entire investigation. Modern forensic work is often portrayed as a dramatic moment where one discovery instantly solves a case. The reality is much slower. It is patient work. It requires specialists examining evidence repeatedly, comparing findings, and ensuring that conclusions are accurate. In the Camden investigation, forensic evidence helped establish links between Hardy and the women whose deaths were being examined. It supported the prosecution's case and provided investigators with the ability to reconstruct parts of a story that had taken place away from public view. The evidence also helped reveal that the crimes were connected. They were not separate tragedies involving unrelated circumstances. They formed part of a pattern involving the same location, the same offender, and women who had all been vulnerable within the same community. As investigators looked deeper into Hardy's background, they found a complicated history. His previous interactions with authorities became a major focus. Records showed that he had experienced periods of psychiatric treatment and had previously come to the attention of different services. These questions are common after major crimes, especially when in details raised difficult questions. Could something have been done differently? Could earlier intervention have changed the outcome? These questions are common after major crimes, especially when an offender has a known history of problems before committing serious violence. However, understanding a person's background is not the same as predicting their future actions. Many people receive mental health treatment. Many people experience personal crises. Very few become violent offenders. The responsibility for Hardy's crimes remained with Hardy himself. The investigation focused on his choices, his actions, and the evidence that connected him to the murders. At the same time, the case exposed challenges faced by systems responsible for protecting vulnerable people. The victims lived in circumstances where danger was already part of their daily reality. Their lives brought them into contact with people they did not always know well. They often had limited resources and fewer opportunities to escape unsafe situations. These realities did not cause the crimes, but they created circumstances that a predator could exploit. That was one of the most painful lessons of the Camden case. The victims were not chosen because they were invisible. They were chosen because the offender believed they could be approached without immediate consequences. This is a pattern seen in many cases involving vulnerable victims. Offenders may look for people who they believe will be less likely to be immediately reported missing, less likely to receive attention, or less able to protect themselves. The responsibility for recognizing and preventing such exploitation falls on society as a whole. It requires communities, support organizations, police services, and healthcare systems to work together. The Camden investigation also highlighted the importance of listening to people who are often overlooked. People working in shelters, outreach workers, community volunteers, friends who share the same streets. These individuals often see changes before official systems do. They notice when someone stops appearing. They notice when behavior changes. They notice when something feels wrong. Their knowledge can become essential during investigations. In the aftermath of Hardy's arrest, many people who knew the Camden community spoke about the women who had been lost. They emphasized that these were not simply victims in a criminal case. They were members of a community. Their deaths affected people who knew them personally and people who had only briefly crossed paths with them. A person remembered from a street corner. A familiar face at a local service. Someone who had shared a conversation during a difficult day. The impact of violence extends far beyond the immediate crime scene. It reaches families, friends, communities, and sometimes entire cities. For London, the Camden murders became a moment of collective shock. The idea that such crimes could occur in a familiar neighborhood challenged assumptions about safety and visibility. People often imagine dangerous places as distant locations. But the reality is that crime can happen anywhere. Behind ordinary doors. On familiar streets. Among people who appear ordinary. That was one of the reasons the case received so much attention. Anthony Hardy did not fit the image many people expected of a violent offender. He was not a stranger arriving from somewhere unknown. He was a resident. Someone who moved through the same environment as everyone else. The investigation forced people to confront an uncomfortable truth: danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes it exists quietly until evidence reveals what was hidden. By early 2003, the case against Hardy was becoming stronger. Investigators had identified the victims. They had connected evidence from the crime scene to Hardy. They had established a timeline that placed him at the center of the investigation. The remaining challenge was legal. Could the evidence prove his responsibility beyond reasonable doubt? The answer would come in court. But before that happened, investigators still had to examine one of the most important parts of the case: the chain of events that transformed a routine police investigation into the discovery of a serial killer. The discovery of the bags in Camden had been the beginning. The surveillance footage had provided a direction. The forensic evidence had provided connections. Now, the investigation was approaching the moment when suspicion would become certainty. The moment when Anthony Hardy would no longer be a person of interest. He would become the man charged with 3 murders. And the story that had begun on a cold London street would move into a courtroom, where evidence, responsibility, and justice would finally be examined in public. The morning of December 30, 2002, began like many other winter mornings in London. There was nothing about the day that suggested it would become the beginning of one of the most significant criminal investigations in modern Camden history. The Christmas period was coming to an end. The city was slowly returning to its normal rhythm after the holidays. Decorations still hung above streets and shop windows. Some businesses remained quieter than usual. Families were preparing for New Year's celebrations. Commuters were beginning to return to familiar routines after days of disrupted schedules and time spent away from work. Camden moved through another ordinary winter morning. The streets carried their usual mixture of people. Residents heading out for errands. Workers opening shops. Visitors exploring the neighborhood. People struggling to survive another cold day. The area had always been a place where different worlds existed together. The same roads used by tourists and shoppers were also used by people who had nowhere stable to sleep. The same sidewalks that hosted weekend crowds became quiet spaces where vulnerable people searched for warmth and safety after dark. That morning, however, something hidden beneath the surface of everyday life was about to be discovered. Near a local pub in Camden, several black plastic bags had been left among ordinary rubbish. To anyone passing by, they appeared unremarkable. London streets were filled with discarded bags, especially during the holiday season when households and businesses produced more waste than usual. There was no obvious sign that these bags contained evidence of a violent crime. They were simply part of the background. Until someone noticed something unusual. The discovery itself was not the result of a planned search. It was an accidental encounter between an ordinary person and something that should never have been there. A closer look revealed that the contents were not household waste. They were human remains. In that moment, the nature of the investigation changed completely. A routine day became a crime scene. A neighborhood problem became a national investigation. Police were called, and officers quickly secured the area. What initially appeared to be a disturbing discovery became something far more serious as investigators examined the evidence. The realization was immediate. Someone had attempted to hide a human body. The question was no longer simply what had been found. The question was who had done this, and whether they might do it again. The Metropolitan Police treated the discovery as a major incident. Specialists were brought in. Detectives began organizing information. The surrounding area was examined carefully, and investigators started searching for anything that could reveal where the remains had come from. At this early stage, they did not know the identity of the victim. They did not know the identity of the offender. They did not know whether this was a single crime or part of something larger. Every possibility had to remain open. This is one of the most challenging moments in any murder investigation. The first hours contain the most uncertainty, but they are also among the most important. Evidence that exists at the beginning may disappear later. Witnesses may forget details. Movements that seem insignificant may become crucial once a suspect is identified. Detectives began asking basic but essential questions. Where had these bags been before they were discovered? How long had they been there? Who had access to this area? Who had been seen nearby? The search expanded outward. Officers examined the immediate surroundings. They spoke with people who lived and worked nearby. They looked for possible routes someone might have taken while transporting the bags. In a city as busy as London, this was not a simple task. Thousands of people moved through Camden every day. Vehicles passed constantly. Businesses opened and closed. Crowds changed from hour to hour. Finding one person within that movement required patience and precision. Then investigators turned to technology. Closed-circuit television cameras had become increasingly common throughout London by the early 2000s. They were positioned around streets, businesses, transport routes, and public spaces. Most people ignored them. But to detectives, they represented potential witnesses. Silent witnesses. A camera could capture a movement that no person remembered. It could show a route, a time, a connection. Investigators began collecting footage from the surrounding area, creating a timeline of activity near the location where the bags were discovered. Hours of recordings had to be reviewed. Most showed ordinary life. People walking. Cars passing. Deliveries being made. Nothing connected to the crime. But investigators understood that within those ordinary moments might be something important. The breakthrough came when officers identified footage showing a man connected to the disposal of the bags. The man was later identified as Anthony Hardy. The discovery of his connection changed the direction of the investigation. What had begun as an unidentified crime scene now had a possible suspect. But detectives still needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. They needed to know who Hardy was. They needed to understand his connection to the victims. And they needed to determine whether the discovery in Camden represented one terrible event or evidence of something much larger. As officers began looking into Hardy's background, they discovered that he was not unknown to authorities. His name had appeared in previous records. His history contained information that would later become central to discussions about the case. Most importantly, investigators discovered that the address connected to Hardy had a significance they had not initially expected. It was not simply where a suspect lived. It was a location connected to earlier events. A place police had already visited months before. That revelation would transform the investigation. Because the discovery in Camden was no longer just about the remains found in black plastic bags. It was about a series of events that had been unfolding quietly for months. And the answers appeared to be waiting behind the door of a flat in Camden. Once investigators identified Anthony Hardy as a person connected to the discovery in Camden, the investigation entered a new and more urgent phase. Finding a possible suspect is only the beginning. A name does not solve a murder. A suspicion does not prove guilt. For detectives, the next challenge was to establish the connection between Hardy, the abandoned bags, the remains discovered inside them, and the events that had taken place before the discovery. The investigation moved from uncertainty toward reconstruction. Who was Anthony Hardy? Where had he been? Who had he interacted with? And what evidence existed that could link him to the crime? The answers would come from multiple sources working together. Witness accounts, surveillance footage, forensic examination, police records. Every piece had to be carefully examined. Anthony Hardy lived in Camden, close to the area where the remains had been found. That geographic connection immediately made him significant to investigators. In many criminal cases, location is one of the first factors detectives examine. A person who lives near a crime scene is not automatically responsible, but proximity can become important when combined with other evidence. The CCTV footage provided one of the first important connections. Investigators had not simply found a person walking through the area. They had found a person whose movements appeared connected to the disposal of the bags. The footage became a timeline. A sequence of movements that could be compared with other evidence gathered during the investigation. But cameras only tell part of a story. They show what happened outside. They cannot reveal what happened behind closed doors. For that, investigators needed to examine Hardy's flat. The search of the property represented a critical moment in the case. Every investigator understands the significance of entering a suspected crime scene. A location can provide answers, but it can also create new questions. The goal is not simply to find evidence that confirms a theory. It is to collect information objectively and allow the evidence to determine what happened. When officers searched Hardy's flat, they discovered evidence that connected him to the victims and strengthened the case against him. The apartment became the center of the investigation. A place where detectives could begin reconstructing the sequence of events. A place where forensic specialists could examine the physical traces left behind. A place where the hidden reality behind an ordinary-looking address began to emerge. The contrast was deeply unsettling. Outside the building, life continued. People walked past. Cars moved along nearby roads. Neighbors carried on with their routines. The world beyond the front door remained unaware of what investigators were uncovering inside. This contrast is one of the most disturbing aspects of many criminal investigations. A home can look peaceful from the outside while containing evidence of location can appear completely ordinary until evidence reveals a different story. A home can look peaceful from the outside while containing evidence of tragedy within. A person can appear like any other member of the community while hiding actions that shock everyone who later learns the truth. As forensic specialists examined the flat, detectives began connecting the evidence to known victims. The investigation soon expanded beyond the remains discovered on December 30th. It became clear that police were not dealing with a single isolated incident. They were looking at a series of deaths. The names of Elizabeth Vallard and Bridget McLennan became central to the investigation. Their deaths were connected to Hardy through the evidence gathered by police. The case was becoming a murder investigation involving multiple victims. This changed the nature of the inquiry. Detectives were no longer only asking what happened at one location. They were trying to understand a pattern. Patterns are important because they reveal behavior over time. A single crime can be difficult to interpret. Multiple crimes involving similar circumstances can show investigators how an offender operates. The victim's circumstances. The location. The method of concealment. The connections between events. Each detail helped form a larger picture. At the same time, investigators revisited previous incidents involving Hardy. This is common in major criminal investigations. When a suspect is linked to a serious crime, police review earlier reports, previous contacts, and unresolved events to determine whether there may be additional connections. For Hardy, this review led investigators back to Sally White. Her death earlier in 2002 became one of the most controversial parts of the case. Months before the discovery in Camden, police had attended Hardy's flat following Sally's death. At that time, the circumstances did not lead to a murder investigation. The initial conclusion was that she had died from natural causes. After Hardy became a murder suspect, the case was examined again. A later review concluded that Sally White had also been murdered. The discovery was devastating. It meant that the number of victims connected to Hardy had increased. It also raised serious questions about the earlier investigation. The public struggled to understand how a man later convicted of multiple murders had previously come to official attention without being stopped. However, the reality of investigations is that decisions are made based on available information at a particular moment. Police officers and medical professionals do not know what future evidence will reveal. A conclusion that appears reasonable at one point may later change when new information becomes available. That does not mean mistakes should be ignored. It means they must be examined carefully. The review of Sally White's death became a major part of the discussion surrounding the case because it represented a tragic possibility that an earlier intervention might have prevented later crimes. But the exact answer to that question could never be known. Investigators could examine evidence. They could establish facts. They could determine responsibility. But they could not rewrite the past. As the investigation continued, the evidence against Hardy became stronger. The man who had once been simply a resident of Camden was now at the center of one of London's most serious homicide investigations. The public learned his name. The media began following every development. The nickname Camden Ripper began appearing in headlines, creating a comparison with the infamous Jack the Ripper cases of Victorian London. But behind the headlines, detectives continued focusing on the same essential task. Building a case. Not a story. Not a rumor. A case based on evidence. Because in court, emotion would not be enough. Public fear would not be enough. The prosecution would need to demonstrate exactly what Anthony Hardy had done and prove his responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. The discovery that began with abandoned bags on a winter street had now uncovered a far larger tragedy. 3 women had lost their lives. A community had been shaken. And investigators were preparing for the next stage, finding every piece of evidence needed to ensure the truth could be established in court. As the investigation moved forward, the picture surrounding Anthony Hardy became clearer. What had first appeared to be a disturbing discovery of human remains was now understood as the beginning of a much larger criminal case. For detectives, every major investigation has a moment when separate pieces begin to connect. At first, there are only fragments. A location. A victim. An unexplained event. Then, slowly, those fragments begin to form a pattern. In the Camden case, that pattern led investigators back repeatedly to the same place. Hardy's flat. The flat became the center of the investigation because it represented the point where multiple strands of evidence appeared to meet. It was connected to Hardy himself, it was connected to the victims, and it provided investigators with the physical evidence necessary to build a prosecution. The importance of a crime scene is not simply what investigators find there. It is also what the location reveals about the events that took place. A crime scene tells a story through details. Not through dramatic moments. Not through assumptions. Through evidence. Forensic specialists examined the property carefully, documenting everything that could help reconstruct the timeline. Their work required patience and precision. A scene that appears chaotic must be approached scientifically. Every item must be recorded. Every potential piece of evidence must be preserved. The goal is not to create a narrative. The goal is to discover one. That distinction is crucial. In high-profile cases, the public often learns about investigations through headlines that simplify events into a few sentences. Behind those headlines, however, are months of detailed work by detectives, forensic experts, legal teams, and support staff. The Camden investigation was no exception. The evidence collected from Hardy's flat helped investigators understand the relationship between the suspect and the victims. It supported the conclusion that the women had been inside the property before their deaths and that Hardy was responsible. But the investigation was not only about proving what happened. It was also about understanding how it happened. How had Hardy come into contact with the victims? Why had they entered his flat? How had he remained undetected? These questions formed part of the broader examination of the case. The answer to some of them was connected to vulnerability. Hardy lived in the same environment as women who were already facing significant challenges. He did not need to travel far to find opportunities to interact with people whose circumstances made them easier to approach. This was one of the most important lessons investigators and observers took from the case. Predators often do not create vulnerability. They search for it. They look for circumstances where trust can be gained quickly, where isolation exists, or where someone may feel they have limited choices. This does not make victims responsible. It reveals the responsibility of offenders who deliberately exploit another person's difficult situation. The women connected to the Camden case were navigating a world where survival often required difficult decisions. Their daily lives involved uncertainty that many people never experience. A stable home provides security. A regular income provides options. A strong support network provides protection. Without those things, people can become exposed to dangers that are harder to escape. This reality became central to the discussions that followed Hardy's arrest. Many people asked whether vulnerable individuals were receiving enough protection and whether warning signs could be identified earlier. The case highlighted the importance of communication between different parts of society. Police, healthcare professionals, support workers, community organizations. Each group may hold a small piece of information. When those pieces are not connected, important details can be missed. The circumstances surrounding Sally White's death became the most painful example of this issue. Her death had already been investigated earlier in 2002. At that time, based on the evidence available, authorities concluded that she had died from natural causes. After Hardy was arrested, the circumstances were reviewed again, and the conclusion changed. The realization that Sally had been murdered raised serious concerns. For her family and those who knew her, the truth came after an additional period of uncertainty. For investigators and officials, it became a difficult examination of how decisions had been made and whether procedures needed to change. The case demonstrated the importance of reviewing investigations when new evidence emerges. A conclusion is not always the final word. New information can change understanding. New evidence can reveal what was previously hidden. That principle is fundamental to criminal justice. The discovery in Camden had reopened questions that extended far beyond one crime scene. It raised questions about missed opportunities, about vulnerable victims, about how society responds when people disappear. But while those wider issues were being debated, detectives remained focused on their immediate responsibility. They needed to ensure that the evidence against Hardy was complete. They needed to establish the identities of the victims. They needed to present a case that could withstand challenge in court. As investigators continued their work, another important question remained. Were there more victims? When a suspect is linked to multiple murders, police often examine whether additional crimes may exist. They review missing person cases. They compare patterns. They look for similarities between known incidents and unresolved investigations. The possibility that Hardy could be connected to other crimes was considered. However, despite examining potential links, police did not find sufficient evidence to charge him with additional murders. Legally, Anthony Hardy was responsible for 3 confirmed killings. Those were the crimes proven in court. That distinction mattered. Investigators could consider possibilities, but courts require evidence. The difference between suspicion and proof is one of the foundations of criminal justice. By early 2003, the investigation had transformed Anthony Hardy from a suspect into a man facing multiple murder charges. The evidence gathered from Camden's streets and Hardy's flat had created a clear direction. The next stage would move away from crime scenes and forensic laboratories. It would move into a courtroom. There, the evidence would be examined publicly. Witnesses would be heard. Legal arguments would be presented. And Anthony Hardy would finally face the consequences of the crimes investigators believed he had committed. The journey from the discovery of discarded bags to a murder trial had taken months of careful work. But for the families of the victims, no amount of investigation could change the most important fact. 3 women were gone. The evidence could explain what happened. The court could deliver a verdict. But justice would always exist alongside loss. And as the case moved toward trial, the focus would shift from discovering the truth to proving it.